Right now, somewhere in the British Library, there is a book that almost didn't exist. A book written by a single monk alone over 5 years of his life. Every single letter drawn by hand. Every single page made from the skin of a calf. And if just one Viking had turned left instead of right on a particular morning in the year 793, you would never have heard of it. That book exists, and it's only one of thousands that survived by the narrowest margin imaginable. Hey, welcome back, my friend. If you're settling in right now, maybe lying down, maybe wrapped up in something warm, maybe just trying to let the day go, I'm really glad you're here. Tonight, we're not going anywhere loud or busy. Tonight, we're going somewhere quiet. Somewhere that smells like old parchment candlelight and very old secrets. Let me ask you something. What if I told you that almost everything you've ever read, every novel, every history book, every line of philosophy, every poem that ever made you feel something almost didn't make it? What if I told you that the words of Aristotle, the stories of Virgil, the wisdom of Plato, the medical knowledge of Hippocrates, all of it came within a breath of being lost forever? And that the only thing standing between us and that darkness was a small group of men in rough wool robes sitting in cold stone rooms copying words by hand onto animal skin one letter at a time. No printing press, no electricity, no backup drive, just ink, parchment, and an almost stubborn, almost irrational belief that knowledge is worth saving. That's the story we're stepping into tonight. And trust me, it's wilder, more human, and more heartbreaking than anything I could make up. Before we go any further, if this kind of storytelling is your thing, if you love falling asleep to history that actually feels alive, I would genuinely love it if you hit that subscribe button and gave this video a like. Cost you nothing, but it means the world to a small channel like this one. And hey, drop a comment down below and tell me where you're watching from tonight. Are you in bed, on the couch somewhere with rain on the window? I always read those and I love them more than you know. Now dim the lights if you can. Maybe put on a soft fan or just let the quiet settle around you and let's begin. The year is around 540 in what used to be the heart of the Roman Empire. Only Rome isn't really Rome anymore. The great city that once ruled from Britain to Babylon has been sacked twice in less than 2 generations. The roads are crumbling. The aqueducts are dry in places. Barbarian kingdoms have carved up the Western Empire like a loaf of bread. The Visigoths here, the Ostrogoths there, the Vandals somewhere else entirely. And the knowledge of the ancient world, the libraries, the schools, the great intellectual tradition of Greece and Rome is quietly, steadily disappearing. Not in one dramatic fire, not in one terrible moment you could point to and say, that's when it happened, but slowly, the way a candle goes out when no one is watching. Papyrus crumbles, parchment rots, old men die, and their libraries are sold off, burned, or simply left to mold in abandoned rooms. And most people are too busy surviving to notice. But there is one man who notices. His name is Magnus Aurelius Cassiodorus, though history just calls him Cassiodorus. And he is at this moment in his life one of the most powerful men in Italy. He has served as a minister, a consul, a chief of civil service to the Ostrogothic kings. For 40 years, he's been at the center of power, writing laws, advising rulers, managing an empire on the edge. By the time he's in his 50s, he's done more for the political world than most people do in 10 lifetimes. And he is exhausted and he is scared. Not of death, he would live to be nearly 100 years old, which is its own kind of miracle for the 6th century, but scared of something worse than death. Scared of forgetting. You see, Cassiodorus understood something that not many people around him did. He understood that civilization is not made of stone. It's not made of armies or gold or roads. Civilization is made of ideas. And ideas only survive if someone writes them down, and written things only survive if someone takes care of them. He had watched the great school in Rome collapse. He had seen libraries go dark. He had actually tried years earlier, to found a Christian university in Rome, where both sacred and secular learning could flourish side by side. But war had made that impossible. The Gothic War had turned Italy into a battlefield, and his dream of a school in Rome died before it could breathe. So he did what any brilliant, slightly obsessive, deeply determined man does when his first plan fails. He came up with a different plan. Around the year 540, Cassiodorus retired from public life. He went back to his family estate in the very south of Italy, a place called Squillace right on the shores of the Ionian Sea. And there, on his own land, he built a monastery. He called it the Vivarium, which in Latin means something like a place for living things. Now, that name was partly literal. There were actually fish ponds on the property, little pools teeming with life which the monks tended for food. But there's something beautiful about that name when you understand what Cassiodorus was really building. A place for living things, living ideas, living words, living knowledge. Because the Vivarium was not like other monasteries. Most monasteries at that time were about prayer, labor, and simple devotion. The monks woke before dawn, prayed in rotation, through the day, worked in the fields, and slept in humble beds. That was holy enough. But Cassiodorus wanted something more. Walking through the Vivarium was, as one historian described it, something like visiting a Christian liberal arts college. Over here was the classical library. Over there, the copy center, what they called the scriptorum. Somewhere else, monks were annotating texts, doing mathematics, studying astronomy. Cassiodorus had designed a place where copying manuscripts was not a side task. It was not something the weakest monks did when they had nothing better to offer. It was sacred work. It was the most important work. He wrote to his monks, and I want you to really sit with this line. He told them that every time they copied a page, they were, in his words, fighting with pen and ink against the unlawful snares of the devil. Fighting with pen and ink. Think about that. A man in the 6th century watching the world collapse around him decided the most powerful weapon available was a quill. And honestly, he wasn't wrong. The library Cassiodorus built at the Vivarium held 231 codes, what we would call books containing works by 92 different authors. That might not sound like much to us now in a world where you can download 1 million books in a second. But in the year 550, having 231 books in one place was extraordinary, almost unheard of. His collection included pagan authors, Aristotle, Cicero, Virgil, sitting on the same shelves as Christian scripture and theology. He had medical texts, works by Galen, and Hippocrates that had traveled centuries to get there. He had astronomy, mathematics, grammar, history, and he didn't just collect them. He organized them by subject in at least 10 aria, which were essentially large book cupboards arranged around the library. He wrote a guide, his great work called The Institution, which was part reading list, part curriculum, part annotated bibliography, telling his monks exactly what to read, in what order, and why. He even wrote about how manuscripts should be handled, corrected, repaired. And this detail always gets me. He specified that biblical manuscripts should be bound in covers worthy of their contents. He included pattern books showing different kinds of bindings. This is believed to be the earliest detailed description of bookbinding in Western history. The man didn't just want to save words, he wanted to honor them. Here's where the story gets both beautiful and quietly heartbreaking. The Vivarium thrived while Cassiodorus was alive. He lived, as I mentioned, to nearly 100 years old, which means he spent decades pouring himself into this project. But after he died around the year 583, the monastery did not survive much longer. The books were dispersed. Some found their way to Rome. Some disappeared entirely. The Vivarium itself was eventually abandoned. And Cassiodorus, this man who had spent his life at the highest levels of power, who had been a consul, a minister, a royal advisor, faded from the pages of popular history. Most people have never heard his name, which is one of the great ironies of history. Because what he started this idea that monks should systematically copy and preserve every piece of knowledge they could get their hands on spread. It spread through Italy, crossed the Alps. It sailed across the sea to Ireland and Britain. It became the defining purpose of hundreds of monasteries across Europe for the next 900 years. One man's retirement project, one man's refusal to let the world forget. That small flame of an idea quietly lit in a fish pond monastery on the southern coast of Italy became the fire that kept Western civilization alive through its darkest centuries. And yet, there's a question that has always nagged at historians, and honestly, it nags at me too. How much did the monks actually understand what they were copying? Were they true scholars passionately engaged with the ideas in their hands? Or were they in many cases faithful craftsmen carefully reproducing words in languages they barely understood in scripts that looked beautiful but meant nothing to them personally? The answer, as you might expect, is complicated. And it changes everything about how we think about this whole story, because there's another layer here that most people never think about. The vivarium was not just about saving the past. Cassiodorus had a plan for the future. He believed deeply earnestly that classical knowledge and Christian faith were not enemies, that you could read Aristotle and still love God, that understanding geometry or astronomy or medicine made you a better servant of the divine, not a worse one. That was a genuinely radical idea in a world where many powerful voices in the church were saying the exact opposite. And the tension between those two views, save all knowledge versus protect the faithful from dangerous ideas, would play out for the next 1,000 years inside the walls of monastic libraries. Sometimes the monks won, sometimes the church won, and sometimes a single manuscript walked the line between treasure and forbidden text, depending entirely on who was in charge. That battle, the battle for what gets remembered and what gets erased, is real of what this whole story is about. Now Cassiodorus was the man who lit the match. But the fire, the real sustained centuries-long fire of monastic learning, needed another architect. Someone whose rules would shape every monastery in Europe. Someone whose one simple command, perhaps the most quietly powerful sentence in medieval history, would turn hundreds of ordinary monasteries into libraries. That man had already been working nearby just a few decades earlier. His name was Benedict of Nurg, and the thing he wrote, a short, plain, unassuming document called the Rule, contains a sentence so understated, so easy to read past that most people never notice it. But that sentence changed the world. And that's exactly where we're headed next. Something about that name has always stuck with me. Benedict of Nea. Not a general, not a king, not a conqueror who reshaped the world with armies and swords, just a man from a small mountain town in central Italy, born around the year 480 into a family of minor Roman nobility who walked into a cave, stayed there for 3 years, and came out with ideas that would quietly transform the intellectual landscape of an entire civilization. Most people have never heard of him either. And yet there's a very strong argument that without this one man and the small document he left behind, a modest set of rules he wrote for a community of monks near the end of his life, the entire tradition of monastic libraries and everything that flowed from it may never have taken root the way it did. This is his story, and it is, in my opinion, one of the most quietly astonishing stories in all of Western history. Let's begin where Benedict himself began Rome. Around the year 500, a young man of about 20 arrives in the city with his old nurse and a head full of ambition. His parents have sent him there to study, to get the kind of classical education that promising young Roman sons were expected to pursue. But Rome in the year 500 is not the Rome of Augustus or Marcus Aurelius. It is a city in slow, painful decline. The last emperor of the Western Roman Empire had been deposed just 24 years earlier. The streets still hold the bones of something magnificent, but the flesh of that magnificence is rotting. Power has fractured. Morality, at least by the standards of a serious young man trying to find meaning in a disintegrating world, is crumbling alongside the aqueducts. According to the historian Pope Gregory the Great, who wrote the definitive account of Benedict's life about 50 years after his death, the young Benedict looked around at his fellow students in Rome, their drinking, their ambitions, their comfortable moral flexibility, and made a decision that most 20-year-olds would find inconceivable. He left not to go home, not to find a better school somewhere else. He walked away from the city entirely, took his nurse with him, and headed into the mountains east of Rome. He ended up eventually at a place called Sabacco, which in Latin roughly means beneath the lake, because it sat below an artificial lake created centuries earlier during the reign of the Emperor Nero. There, on a rocky hillside above the water, was a cave, a small dark triangular-shaped opening in the cliff face perhaps 10 feet deep, and Benedict moved in. He met a monk named Romanus on the road who gave him a simple monk's habit made of animal skins. And for 3 years, Benedict lived alone in that cave 500 feet above the valley floor. Romanes would climb down to bring him food on a rope. Let me paint that picture for you for just a moment, because I think we rush past it too easily. A young man from a good family with every opportunity the crumbling Roman world could still offer, choosing to live in a cliffside cave alone, eating whatever someone could lower to him on a rope. Not because he was depressed, not because he had failed, but because he was searching for something the busy, noisy world outside simply could not give him. Silence, purpose, a life that meant something deeper than ambition. Pope Gregory later wrote that during those years Benedict wrestled with loneliness and with powerful temptations, that more than once he nearly abandoned his solitude and went back to the world. And yet he stayed. And what he found in that silence, whatever interior clarity those 3 years of rock and cold water and rope-delivered bread carved into him, would become the foundation of everything that followed. He emerged from Sububako, a changed man. Word spread, as it tends to do when someone genuinely commits themselves to something unusual, and monks from the surrounding area began finding their way to him, asking him to lead them. He tried. The experiment didn't always go smoothly. One community he agreed to lead liked him so little that, according to Pope Gregory, they tried to poison his wine. He blessed the cup. It shattered. And with considerable understatement, Benedict apparently looked at the monks and said something along the lines of, "God forgive you. I told you our ways would not agree." Then he walked back to his cave, which, if you ask me, is the single most composed response to attempted murder I have ever heard of. Eventually, around the year 529, he left Sububako for good. He traveled south to a hilltop between Rome and Naples, a place called Monte Cassino, where a ruined pagan temple of Apollo still sat on the ridge like the skeleton of an older world. And there, on the hilltop, he built his monastery. The monastery that would become the spiritual headquarters of Western monasticism. The model that hundreds of other monasteries across Europe would eventually look to, the place where, near the end of his life, he wrote the document that changed everything. He called it simply the Rule. Now, I want to spend some time with this document because I think it is one of the most underappreciated texts in human history. And the way most people talk about it, when they talk about it at all, misses something essential. The Rule of Saint Benedict is short, shockingly short for something so influential. It is a practical guide. 73 chapters, many of them just a paragraph or two telling monks how to organize their days, how to treat guests, how to choose a leader, how to handle conflict. It is not a grand philosophical treatise. It is not a theological masterwork. It is in many ways closer to what today we might call an employee handbook. And yet, embedded within it, in one of its chapters, almost as a passing observation, is a sentence that I keep coming back to. Chapter 48, the chapter on daily manual labor. Benedict opens it with this: "Idleness is the enemy of the soul." That's it. 8 words. Therefore, he continues, the brother should have specified periods for manual labor as well as for prayerful reading. Now, I want to ask you something, and I mean this as a genuine question, not a rhetorical one. When you first hear that sentence, what does it sound like to you? Does it sound like a library? Because it shouldn't. And for most of the history of this rule, it wasn't automatically understood as one. What Benedict was primarily concerned about, practically speaking, was keeping his monks occupied. Idle monks, he knew from hard experience, were unhappy monks. Unhappy monks stirred up trouble. Trouble disrupted the contemplative life he was trying to build. So he structured the day. Prayer at fixed hours, manual work. And then here's the part that matters: reading. He specified how much. In the summer months after the morning prayer, monks were to work until around 10 o'clock in the morning. Then from 10 until noon reading. After the midday rest, more work until the evening. In winter, the reading period shifted and expanded. And during Lent, the 40 days of fasting and reflection before Easter. Each monk was to receive an entire book from the library and read it completely through. Pause on that for a second. An entire book from the library. That means every monastery following this rule needed to have a library. Had to have one. Not as an optional luxury, not as a sign of prestige, but as a basic necessary feature of monastic life, as fundamental as a kitchen or a chapel. And to have a library, you needed books. And to have books in the 6th, 7th, 8th century, before paper, before printing presses, in a world where books were handmade objects of extraordinary value and rarity, you needed people who could write them, which meant you needed a scriptorum, which meant you needed trained scribes, which meant you needed a system. None of this was what Benedict planned. He was not, as far as anyone can tell, primarily interested in building a great intellectual tradition. He was a practical man trying to solve a practical problem. How do you keep a community of monks spiritually healthy and spiritually occupied? Reading was part of his answer. And reading, as so often happens with simple, honest ideas, turned out to be far more transformative than anyone anticipated. Here's what I find genuinely fascinating about this. and it's something historians don't always highlight clearly. The rule of Saint Benedict was not at first the dominant rule in Western monasticism. There were dozens of other rules competing for influence across Europe in the 6th and 7th centuries. Different monasteries followed different traditions. But over time, through the patronage of Charlemagne in the 8th century, through the endorsement of successive popes, through the sheer practical wisdom of what Benedict had written, the rule spread. By the 9th century, most monasteries in Western Europe were following it. And every one of them, because of those 8 words in chapter 48, was now institutionally obligated to maintain a library. Hundreds of monasteries across France, Germany, Spain, England, Ireland, Italy, all of them by the requirements of their own founding principles, custodians of books. Not because anyone planned a great network of knowledge preservation, not because some visionary council decided to save civilization, but because a man in a cave decided that idleness was the enemy of the soul, and that reading was a remedy. There's one more dimension to this that I think deserves its own moment. Benedict's rule is often summarized by the Latin phrase ora labor, pray and work, and that is accurate as far as it goes. But what the rule actually describes is something more like pray, work, and read. And the balance between those three, the rhythm Benedict built into the monastic day, created something that the ancient world had never quite managed: a stable institution where intellectual life was protected. Not by the whims of a wealthy patron, not by the policies of a particular emperor, but by a daily schedule. Every day at a fixed hour, monks stopped what they were doing and read. Rain or shine, plague or peace, political upheaval or quiet prosperity. The reading hour did not move. Think about what that means. Across centuries, across 900 years of barbarian migrations, political collapses, wars, famines, and upheavals. While the world outside monastery walls changed almost beyond recognition, inside those walls at a fixed time every day a monk sat down with a book, and the books kept being copied, and the libraries kept growing, and the knowledge kept surviving because of a daily schedule, because of 8 words. Now, I've been talking about the rule as a document, a set of instructions, but there's a question underneath all of this that I keep circling back to, and it's one I'd love to know your thoughts on. Drop it in the comments if you're still awake enough to type. But what does it say about us as human beings? That one of the most powerful forces for preserving knowledge and history wasn't a grand institution or a royal library, but a community of people quietly keeping a daily habit. Because I think there's something in that worth sitting with, not just as history, but as a question about how any of us protect the things we care about. Of course, knowing you need books is one thing. Actually, making them is something else. Entirely because once the rule spread and monasteries began building their libraries in earnest, once it became clear that hundreds of communities across Europe all needed books, and the only way to get books was to make them, the question of how exactly that was done became its own extraordinary story. And the place where that story lived, the one room inside every working monastery that held the whole impossible weight of medieval knowledge production, had a name: the scriptorum. And what went on inside it, the labor, the silence, the occasional bursts of very irreverent humor that monks scratched into the margins when they thought no one was watching. That is one of the most vivid, most human, and most surprisingly funny corners of medieval life I've ever encountered. That's exactly where we're going next. Picture this. You're standing in a doorway, stone arch, cold air on your face, looking into a long, narrow room somewhere in the heart of a medieval monastery. The year is somewhere around the 9th century, and the morning light is just beginning to come through the tall windows along the eastern wall. The room is silent. Not the comfortable silence of a bedroom, not the easy silence of an early morning before the house wakes up. This is a different kind of silence, enforced, mandatory, sacred. Because this room, this quiet, cold, impossibly disciplined room, is the scriptorum. And the men bent over the slanted wooden desks along those windows, hunched at careful angles with quill in hand, are doing something that the world outside those walls desperately needs. Even if the world outside doesn't know it yet, they are making books. The word scriptorum comes from Latin, and it means exactly what it sounds like: a place for writing. Simple enough. But the reality of what happened inside one, the physical, painstaking, sometimes maddening, occasionally transcendent reality, is one of those corners of history that I think deserves far more attention than it usually gets. So let's go inside. Let's really go inside and look at what these men were actually doing hour by hour, day by day, because I promise you what you find there is stranger, harder, more human, and funnier than almost anything you've been taught. First, the room itself. The most detailed picture we have of an ideal scriptorum comes from a remarkable architectural plan of the monastery of St. Gall in Switzerland drawn up somewhere around the years 820 to 830. It is essentially a blueprint, an aspirational design for a perfect monastery, and the scriptorum sits in a privileged position in the plan tucked into a corner directly below the library, positioned to catch the morning light through 7 windows spaced evenly along 2 outer walls. 7 writing desks, 1 in front of each window. Each desk roughly 1 m square, just enough space for an open manuscript and a small tray of tools. A large central table for storing work in progress. Wool benches along the southern and western sides where supervisors sat and overseers watched. 7 monks working simultaneously in silence. The room faced east deliberately so that the best light of the day, the clear, steady light of morning, fell directly onto the work surface. Not for atmosphere, not for mood, because precision demanded it. The letter forms in these manuscripts were so small, so fine, so exacting that working in poor light wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. A mistake made in shadow was a mistake no one might catch until the book was finished. And finished books were not thrown away. Now, I want to be honest about something because I think the popular image of the scriptorum gets a few things slightly wrong. When most people imagine monks copying manuscripts, they picture a large communal hall rows and rows of robed figures shoulder to shoulder working in unison like some kind of medieval assembly line. That image is romantic. It's cinematic. It's also, for most of history, not quite accurate. The reality was more varied and in some ways more interesting. Many of the great manuscripts of the early medieval period were produced not in a large communal room, but by individual monks working alone in their cells or in small private carrels built into the walls of the cloister. Consider the Lindisfarne Gospels, one of the most breathtaking illuminated manuscripts ever made. Created around the year 700 on a small island off the coast of northern England. It is believed to have been the work of a single monk ID Bishop of Lindisfarne working largely by himself, likely during periods of solitary retreat, on an even smaller island nearby called St. Cuthbert's. 258 pages of extraordinarily intricate artwork and calligraphy. 1 man years of his life alone. When you hold that thought, really hold it. The word dedicated starts to feel a little inadequate. But back to the communal scriptorum, because for the larger monasteries, the assembly hall model was very real and the work done there followed a system of almost industrial precision. The process of making a manuscript, a real finished durable manuscript, was not a single task. It was a production chain and every stage had specialists. It started long before anyone put pen to parchment. It started with the animals. Most medieval manuscripts were written on parchment, specially treated animal skin, most often sheep, but also cattle and goat. The best quality parchment, called vellum, came from the youngest animals, sometimes newborn, sometimes even unborn. It was pale, nearly translucent, impossibly smooth when prepared correctly, and preparing it was its own ordeal. The skin was first soaked in a lime solution to loosen the hair, sometimes for several days. Then it was scraped carefully repeatedly while still wet and stretched tight on a wooden frame. As it dried, it was scraped again, pulling the surface tighter and smoother, then scraped once more. 1 good sheet of parchment might take the better part of a day to prepare. A single Bible, 1 complete Bible, required the skins of approximately 160 calves. 160 calves for 1 book. Pause there for a moment and think about what that means in terms of resources, planning, and sheer commitment. The next time someone tells you a book changed their life, imagine the logistical operation behind that statement in the 9th century. Once the parchment was ready, the scribe's work could begin. But even sitting down with a blank sheet of beautifully prepared parchment in front of you was only the beginning of a very long, very methodical process. First, the sheet had to be ruled, faint lines pressed or scratched into the surface, perfectly evenly spaced to keep the text straight and uniform. A crooked line of text in a sacred manuscript was not acceptable. Then the scribe would begin copying. Not writing from memory, not composing original thoughts, copying. Taking an existing manuscript called the exemplar and reproducing it letter by letter, word by word on the new sheet. The scribe held his quill cut from the primary feather of a large bird, usually a goose, sometimes a swan, at a specific angle, and made each letter in a specific sequence of strokes called the ductus. Every letter had its correct way of being formed, and deviation from the house style was not encouraged. He worked in silence at a fixed angle on a slanted desk in whatever light the morning had given him, 6 hours a day minimum. The very best scribes worked longer. There are records, notably from the monastery of Vivarium in earlier centuries, of exceptional scribes being excused from some prayer hours so they could spend more time copying. They received extra candles and remarkably a water clock to measure the passing hours. Now, here is where I find the whole story becoming unexpectedly and wonderfully human. Because here is what nobody tells you about the scriptorum. It was absolutely unambiguously miserable, and the monks knew it. And some of them, in what is perhaps the most relatable act in all of medieval history, wrote about it in the margins of the very manuscripts they were supposed to be producing in holy silence. I am not making this up. Medieval manuscripts are full of what scholars call marginalia, small notes, sketches, and observations that scribes added in the white spaces around the main text. Most of these are corrections or annotations, but a significant number of them are something else entirely. They are complaints, raw, unfiltered, entirely human complaints scratched into the margins of sacred texts by men who had clearly reached their limit. Listen to some of these from an unknown Irish monk somewhere in the 9th or 10th century, written in the margin of a theological text he was copying. Writing is excessive drudgery, crooks your back, it dims your sight, it twists your stomach and your sides. From another manuscript, thank God it will soon be dark. From another, oh my hand, just that 2 words, oh my hand. And somehow across 11 or 12 centuries, you feel exactly what he felt from yet another new parchment, bad ink. I say nothing more, which honestly has the energy of someone closing their laptop in disgust and going to make tea. One scribe somewhere in the 9th century finished a particularly difficult text and wrote in the margin at the very end, "As the harbor is welcome to the sailor, so is the last line to the scribe." And my personal favorite, a monk who apparently reached the end of a long and tedious work by a well-known theologian, and couldn't help himself. Here ends the second part of this work, very long, very verbose, and very tedious with the scribe. Thank God, and again thank God. I want you to sit with this for a second because I think there's something genuinely moving in these little notes underneath the humor. These men were not machines. They were not automatons in robes mechanically reproducing text without inner experience. They were people. They were cold. They were tired. Their backs hurt and their eyes ached, and sometimes the parchment was hairy, and the ink was thin, and the light was going, and they still had 30 more pages to copy before the day was done. And yet they kept going. Not all of them cheerfully, not all of them willingly, but they kept going. Historians who have studied this phenomenon have noted that monks in the scriptorum frequently suffered from a condition. The medieval church actually had a name for adia. It was described as a foul darkness of the spirit, a creeping apathy and restlessness that settled over a person doing long, repetitive, solitary work. The description in ancient texts is startling in how familiar it sounds. The affected monk grows anxious, unfocused, hopeless feeling, as one ancient writer put it, as though the sun was moving too slowly across the sky. Modern psychologists reading those descriptions recognize what they are describing, something very much like clinical depression. The medieval world knew this was a risk of the scriptorum. They didn't have the vocabulary we have today for it, but they understood in practical terms that long hours of silent, repetitive copying in a cold stone room was not exactly good for the human spirit. And yet the books kept being made. Can I ask you something? Do you have a practice in your own life? Something you do regularly, not because it's fun or exciting or rewarding in the obvious sense, but because you've decided it matters, a habit that costs you something, that asks something real from you, even on the days when it feels pointless. Because I think about those monks in the scriptorum sometimes when I'm struggling through something that feels tedious and small. Oh my hand, and somehow it helps. Now, not everything in the scriptorum was grim. There was another dimension to this story, the illuminators. While the scribes were doing the grinding, disciplined work of copying text, there was another class of craftsmen in the medieval bookmaking world whose job was something altogether different. Their job was beauty. The illuminators, sometimes monks, sometimes lay artists working for hire, were responsible for the decorated letters, the illustrations, the gilded backgrounds, the miniature portraits of evangelists and saints that turned medieval manuscripts from documents into objects of breathtaking art. The word illuminated comes from the Latin for light, and the gold leaf used in these decorations was precisely that. It didn't just reflect light. In the flicker of a candle, a gilded initial page literally seemed to glow from within, as if lit by some interior source. The pigments used were extraordinary. Ultramarine blue from ground lapis lazuli imported at enormous expense from Afghanistan. Vermilion red from cinnabar. Gold beaten to a thinness nearly beyond imagining. In the later medieval period, even genuine powdered gold was mixed into ink and painted directly onto the page. Entire teams of people collaborated on a single manuscript. Parchment makers, scribes, lubricators who added the red headings and colored initials, illuminators who painted the decorations, and finally the binders who assembled the finished pages into a book, sometimes binding them in covers of carved ivory or tolled leather or even jeweled metal. One large illuminated Bible completed at a Cistercian monastery in Burgundy in the early 12th century is estimated to have taken the entire resources of the scriptorum several years to produce years for one book. And here is what makes all of this so remarkable when you pull back and look at the full picture. This was how knowledge was reproduced, distributed, and preserved for nearly 1,000 years. Not through a technology, not through a machine, not through any system more efficient than a human being sitting at a wooden desk holding a quill, moving it across prepared animal skin letter by careful letter. The entire intellectual inheritance of the ancient world, or at least the part of it that survived, passed through human hands, through tired hands, cold hands, hands that sometimes wrote in the margins, "Oh, my hand." Those hands are why you can read Virgil today. Those hands are why Aristotle wasn't entirely lost. Those hands are why history has a record at all. And I think that deserves more than a passing footnote. But here's the thing that has always nagged at me, and it's the question that shifts everything we've been talking about into something darker, something more complicated, something that the monasteries themselves wrestled with for centuries. What were the monks actually allowed to copy? Because it wasn't everything. It wasn't even close to everything. The history of the scriptorum is also the history of a profound, sometimes agonizing tension between two impulses. Is the impulse to preserve knowledge and the impulse to control it. And nowhere is that tension more vivid, more human, more dramatic, more consequential than in the question of what happened when a monk in the scriptorum was handed a text written by someone who didn't believe in God. What happened when the pagan authors arrived at the desk? What happened when Oid walked in the room? That is a story full of contradiction, compromise, courage, and something that looks remarkably like intellectual hypocrisy. And it is exactly where we're headed next. There's a gesture I want you to picture in your mind. A monk somewhere in Germany, sometime in the 11th century, walks quietly into the library of his monastery. He approaches the librarian, who is sitting in silence. The rule of silence is in force, as it often is. No speaking aloud. The monk needs a book, specifically a pagan book. A book written by someone who lived centuries before Christ, who worshipped gods with names like Jupiter and Venus, who told stories involving seduction, sorcery, and the kind of erotic poetry that would make most people in this monastery break out into a cold sweat. But he needs it or wants it, or perhaps just quietly, guilty craves it the way a person sometimes craves something they know they probably shouldn't have. So he makes a sign. He reaches up and scratches behind his own ear, like a dog. Because at the monastery of here in 11th century Germany, that was the official sign for a pagan book. You scratch behind your ear, the gesture imitating a dog's hind leg, because dogs in medieval Christian symbolism were associated with pagans. The people outside the faith, the unclean. And just in case that wasn't expressive enough, there was an alternative sign. You could stick 2 fingers in your mouth as if you were about to be sick. Because apparently in certain monasteries requesting classical literature was officially gestured as something between canine behavior and mild nausea. I have been sitting with this detail for years, and I still find it extraordinary. Not because it's funny, though it genuinely is, but because of what it reveals about the strange, tortured, deeply human relationship between medieval monasticism and the books it couldn't quite bring itself to throw away. This is the paradox at the heart of monastic learning that almost never gets properly examined. The monasteries were the primary institutions preserving ancient knowledge in medieval Europe. That much we've established. But what is less often discussed, what gets glossed over in the comfortable narrative of monks as heroic guardians of civilization, is that the church whose monasteries were doing the preserving was simultaneously, deeply, genuinely, sometimes fiercely suspicious of the content being preserved. This was not a simple tension. It was not neatly resolved. It played out differently in different monasteries, in different centuries, and sometimes in different rooms of the same building. And the question it raises, who decides what knowledge is worth keeping and on what grounds and with what consequences, is one that stretches far beyond the Middle Ages. To understand the problem clearly, you have to understand what pagan literature actually meant in this context. It wasn't just mythology. It wasn't just stories of gods and heroes which the church could dismiss as harmless fiction or reinterpret as allegory. It included philosophy, Aristotle's logic and natural science, Plato's theories of the soul. It included medicine, the clinical empirical, sometimes uncomfortably materialist works of Galen and Hippocrates. It included rhetoric Cicero, the greatest prose stylist in the Latin language. It included poetry Virgil, Horace, Ovid. Virgil was perhaps the most beloved and the most tolerated. He wrote an epic about the founding of Rome, and one of his pastoral poems contained a stanza that medieval scholars convinced themselves was actually a prophecy of the birth of Christ, an interpretation that Virgil almost certainly never intended, but which gave him a kind of honorary pre-Christian status and made copying his work feel safe. Horace was trickier, beautiful, witty, morally flexible. Monks copied him with varying degrees of comfort. And then there was Ovid. Ovid was a problem. Ovid had written, among other things, a manual of seduction called The Art of Love. He had written the Metamorphoses full of gods behaving in ways that would never pass a content review. He had written passionate, sensual, occasionally very explicit love poetry. And yet, here is the part that fascinates me. Monks copied him. Not all monks, not all monasteries, but enough of them, often enough that Ovid survived the medieval period in multiple copies carried forward by the very hands of men who had sworn vows of celibacy. The historian of the Renaissance Bernruck puts it beautifully. The monks preserved the pagan authors often without intending to do so or even realizing it. Because when you copy Boethius, you simultaneously keep Aristotle alive. When you study the Venerable Bede, you find yourself reading passages of Plin's Natural History embedded within his work. The pagan content traveled quietly inside the Christian container. But there were also monks who knew exactly what they were copying and copied it anyway because they loved it. I want to tell you about one of them. His name was Lupus, and he was the abbot of a monastery called Friar in the heart of France in the 9th century. Lupus of Friar, sometimes called Svetus Lupus, is one of the most quietly extraordinary figures in medieval intellectual history. Over 130 of his letters survive, and reading them is like discovering a time capsule of a very particular kind of obsessive personality, because Lupus, despite being a man of God, a Benedictine monk and abbot, responsible for the spiritual well-being of an entire community, was at his core an unashamed book addict. He wrote letters to abbots, bishops, scholars, and emperors, begging, bargaining, and sometimes quite shamelessly, flattering his way into borrowing manuscripts. Not religious texts, classical texts. Cicero, Suetonius, Livy. Around the year 835, he wrote to Einhard, the great Frankish scholar and biographer of Charlemagne, specifically requesting permission to borrow and copy Cicero's De Orator, one of the great works of classical rhetoric. Lupus probably received permission. We know this because the copy he made with his own hand still exists. It sits today in the British Library listed as Harley Manuscript 2736. Think about that for a moment. A 9th century monk's handwritten copy of a pre-Christian Roman text sitting in a library in London more than 1,200 years later. You could, if you were so inclined, go and see it. What Lupus understood and articulated with unusual clarity for his time was that reading Cicero and reading scripture were not opposing activities. That the discipline of language, the precision of argument, the beauty of rhetoric, these were tools that sharpen the mind regardless of who had originally wielded them. He has been called by some modern scholars the first humanist, a man in a monastery in the 9th century who thought like someone from the Renaissance. Yet for every lupus there was a different kind of monk, one who kept those pagan books at arm's length, sometimes literally. The sign language detail from hers that I mentioned at the start of this part, the ear scratch, the 2 fingers in the mouth, comes from a real document. The sign systems of medieval monasteries were recorded in written manuals, and the ones from here and the great Abbey of Cluny in France have been studied by scholars in remarkable detail. Cluny, founded in the year 910 in Burgundy, developed one of the most elaborate sign language systems in medieval Europe. By the 11th century, when the community had grown to number several hundred monks, ordinary speech was permitted for only about half an hour each day after the morning's chapter meeting, and even less time at other points of the day for everything else signs. There were signs for fish, for vegetables, for bread, signs for candles, for needles, for the different kinds of service books used in the liturgy, signs for monk, for priest, for abbot. More than 100 specific signs recorded in their manuals, and likely more in daily use. And embedded within this practical vocabulary was a whole taxonomy of the world's intellectual inheritance and the Church's attitude toward it. The pagan book got the dog scratch. Other kinds of texts had their own distinct gestures. The hierarchy of what was sacred and what was merely tolerated was written right into the body language of the monks. I find this remarkable. Honestly, the sign language of the monastery is not just a quirky historical detail. It's a map of the medieval mind of what people valued, what they feared, what they needed, and what they weren't quite sure what to do with. Now, here's the part of this story that I think gets misrepresented more than almost anything else in popular history. There's a version of this narrative, you've probably heard some form of it, that goes something like, the Church suppressed ancient knowledge. The monasteries locked knowledge away. The Renaissance was when brave secular scholars finally broke free of religious control and rediscovered what the Church had been hiding. That narrative is dramatic, dissatisfying. It has a clear villain and a clear hero. It is also, in important ways, wrong, or at least far too simple, to be honest. Because the reality is messier, more interesting, and more human than a simple story of suppression and liberation. Yes, there were moments of genuine institutional hostility towards certain texts. At the University of Paris in the years between 1210 and 1277, Aristotle's newly translated works on natural philosophy were condemned multiple times because some of his conclusions seemed to contradict the idea of a personal God or the immortality of the soul. Those condemnations were real, and they had real effects. And yes, pagan texts occupied an uncomfortable position in the medieval library. Sometimes shelved separately, sometimes annotated with warnings, sometimes simply not copied when the resources ran low and priorities had to be made. But suppression is not the same as erasure, and the monks who copied pagan books did not see themselves as rebels or subversives. Most of them saw themselves as exactly what Lupus of Friar articulated: people using the tools of classical learning in service of a greater truth. The Church did not destroy Ovid. The Church's monasteries are the reason Oid exists. So what then was actually going on? If you want my honest view, and I realize this is where I step away from pure narration and into something more personal, I think the medieval monastery's relationship with pagan knowledge was one of the most honest intellectual relationships in history, precisely because it acknowledged the tension rather than pretending it didn't exist. The monks knew these books contained ideas that conflicted with their faith. They didn't pretend otherwise. Some of them developed elaborate theological frameworks to justify copying pagan texts. Some of them just copied them because they were beautiful and they couldn't help themselves. Some of them, like the monks at Hirsa, built the tension directly into the grammar of their sign language. This book is complicated, the gesture said. This book is from a different world than ours, and still they copied it. Does that make them hypocrites? Or does it make them something else? Something more nuanced and, in my view, more admirable, people who held contradictions without resolving them, who preserved what they couldn't entirely approve of because some part of them understood that the world needs things it cannot yet fully justify. I've thought about this, more than I probably should, and I keep coming back to the same conclusion. The monks were not guardians of a perfectly curated, ideologically consistent archive. They were human beings making imperfect, complicated, sometimes contradictory decisions about what to keep. And because of those decisions, the messy, tension-filled, dog-scratching, behind-the-ear decisions, we have Virgil and Oid and Cicero and Aristotle. And yet, here is where the story darkens. Because while some monasteries bent their principles in the direction of preservation, others went in the opposite direction, and the weapon they used was not censorship through ignoring books, but something far more dramatic, far more final, the act of physically erasing what had been written. There is a word for what happened when a monk took a perfectly good manuscript, perhaps containing Cicero, perhaps containing some ancient Greek medical text, perhaps containing something no one had copied for 100 years and would never copy again, and scraped the ink from the parchment to make room for a prayer. That word is palimpsest, and the story of palimpsests, of what was lost, of what was almost lost, and of how modern science is now reaching back across 1,000 years to read the words beneath the prayers, is one of the most quietly devastating and quietly miraculous stories I know. That's where we're headed next. The word itself sounds almost gentle, doesn't it? Palimpsest. Say it slowly. Palimps. It comes from the Greek palimpestos, meaning roughly scraped again. And in those two quiet syllables is contained one of the most sobering stories in the history of human knowledge. Because a palimpsest is what you get when someone takes a manuscript, a real precious irreplaceable manuscript, and scrapes the ink from the surface of the parchment, not to destroy it. Not out of carelessness or malice, though the effect is sometimes the same, but because parchment was expensive, extraordinarily expensive, and the monks who needed to write new things didn't always have the resources to make new sheets. So they recycled. They took the old words off the page, and they wrote new ones on top. Now, here's the thing that makes palimpsest so extraordinary, so haunting, and so relevant to everything we've been building toward in this story. Ink on parchment doesn't vanish completely when you scrape it. The scraping removes what the eye can see, but the iron compounds in medieval ink, the same iron and oak gall formula that gave manuscripts their characteristic dark brown or reddish-black color. Those compounds leave a trace in the material of the parchment itself, a ghostly shadow, a whisper where there used to be a voice. And for centuries, for over 1,000 years, in some cases those whispers were simply inaudible. The new text covered them. The new prayers, the new liturgy, the new theological commentary sat on top of the old mathematics and philosophy and history, and nobody knew what had been lost until someone started listening more carefully. Let me take you to the 10th century. Constantinople, the great city of the Byzantine Empire, seat of a civilization that had kept the Greek intellectual tradition alive while Western Europe fumbled through its darkest centuries. Sometime around the year 1000, a monk, we don't know his name, sat down with several manuscripts by the Greek mathematician Archimedes. The original text had been copied generations earlier, probably from much older sources. It contained mathematical treatises that Archimedes had written in the 3rd century before the Common Era works on geometry, on the mechanics of floating bodies, on a mathematical puzzle called the stomach that would not be recognized for what it was for another 1,000 years. This monk needed parchment. He had a project, a prayer book for religious use. A Eucalian, it was called a book of prayers and liturgical texts. So he took the Archimedes manuscripts, he unbound them, he rotated the pages 90 degrees, turning the columns of Greek mathematics sideways, and he scraped and he wrote his prayers over the top. He had no way of knowing what he was erasing. Or perhaps he did and decided that prayers for the living mattered more than equations from the dead. Either way, the Archimedes text disappeared, covered over, hidden under a century's worth of devotion. And there it sat for 900 years. The prayer book passed from monastery to monastery. It spent time at the monastery of Mar Saba in the Judean desert. It moved to Constantinople, where it eventually found its way into the library of the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate of Jerusalem in the city. It was catalogued. It was used. It was stored. And the faint shadows of Archimedes, the ghost of the greatest mathematician of antiquity, lay quietly beneath the prayers waiting. In the year 1899, a Greek scholar named Papadopoulos Karamus was cataloging the library's manuscripts. He noticed something odd about this prayer book. Between the lines of the liturgical text, he could just make out traces of other writing, older writing in a different direction. He included a transcription of a few lines in his catalog. Those lines caught the attention of a Danish scholar named Johann Ludwig Heiberg, who was at that moment considered the world's foremost authority on Archimedes. Heiberg read the catalog description. He recognized the mathematical language instantly, and in 196 he traveled to Constantinople. What he found when he held the prayer book under proper light and began examining it with a magnifying glass left him almost speechless. He was looking at works of Archimedes that no one had seen in nearly 1,000 years, including most remarkably the only surviving copy of a text called On the Method of Mechanical Theorems, a work in which Archimedes essentially described how he figured things out before he proved them, his thinking process, his intellectual method, a text that until that prayer book was completely unknown to modern scholarship. Heiberg photographed every page he could and published his findings. The mathematical world was electrified, but the story didn't end there because it is, if anything, a story that refuses to end neatly. After Heiberg's visit, the manuscript went missing. Sometime in the chaos of the First World War and its aftermath, as the Greek community in Constantinople was subjected to terrible pressures and forced departures, the prayer book disappeared. It ended up somehow in the hands of a French family. It sat in private hands for 70 years. At some point, someone added fake medieval religious illustrations to several of its pages, probably hoping to make it look more valuable, almost certainly damaging the ancient text beneath them in the process. Then, in 1998, the manuscript appeared at Christie's auction house in New York City and sold for $2 million to an anonymous American buyer. The Greek Orthodox Church contested the sale in court, arguing the manuscript had been stolen from their library in the 1920s. A federal judge ruled in favor of the auction house. The anonymous buyer, described in court documents only as a private American individual working in the high-technology industry, then did something remarkable. They loaned the manuscript to the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore, Maryland for scholarly study. And over the following decade, a team of scientists from the Rochester Institute of Technology and Johns Hopkins University brought the full force of 21st century imaging technology to bear on those 900-year-old pages. 12 spectral bands of light, ultraviolet, infrared, raking light at precise angles. And for the pages where the forged paintings had made conventional imaging useless, something more dramatic. Still X-rays from the Stanford Linear Accelerator Center in California firing synchrotron radiation at near the speed of light through the parchment. The prayers faded. The paintings became transparent and Archimedes came back. Can I tell you what they found? Because this is the part that genuinely astonishes me every time I think about it. Among the recovered texts was the method, the one Heiberg had first seen in 196, but which could now be read far more completely and clearly. And in it, Archimedes described a way of thinking about infinity and about the summing of infinitely many small quantities. A way of thinking that would not be formally developed in Western mathematics until the invention of calculus by Newton and Linnaeus in the 17th century, nearly 2,000 years before Newton. The ideas were there on those pages, scraped over and written on top of and hidden under prayers for 900 years. If a 13th century monk in Constantinople had had slightly more parchment to work with, if economics had broken differently, if the monastery had been a little wealthier, we might have had the concept of infinite decimal calculus 1,000 years earlier than we did. That thought sits with me, and I suspect it will sit with you if you let it. And here is something that feels almost surreal to say because this story, which I've carried with me for years, just got a new chapter. Literally days ago, as of this recording, a researcher named Victor Gassenberg, working at a center for ancient thought in Paris, was examining the art collection of a small museum in Bliss in central France. And he found it, a missing page, one of 3 pages from the Archimedes Palimpsest that had been documented in Heiberg's 196 photographs, but had never been found in the manuscript when it resurfaced. Page 123 of the palimpsest containing a passage from Archimedes on the surface area of a sphere and its volume. It has been sitting in a French art museum among paintings and antiquities unidentified for over a century. Gissenberg compared it to Heiberg's original photographs. The handwriting matched, the geometric diagrams matched, even the copying errors matched. It was the same page found in Blaze. Right now, plans are being made to image it with the same multispectral and X-ray fluorescence technology used on the rest of the palimpsest. There may be more to read than anyone currently knows. The search, it turns out, is still ongoing. A 1,000-year-old story is still producing new chapters in 2026. Now, the Archimedes palimpsest is the most dramatic example of this phenomenon, but it is far from the only one. In the year 1819, the same year that Heiberg was born as it happens, Though he would not photograph the Archimedes manuscript for another 87 years, a scholar named Cardinal Angelo Mai was working in the Vatican Library in Rome. He was examining a manuscript from the monastery of Bobbio in northern Italy. A 7th century copy of St. Augustine's commentary on the Psalms. He noticed something. Faint traces of an older text beneath the Augustine. He applied chemical reagents crude by modern standards and in some cases damaging to the parchment to bring the hidden text into visibility. What emerged beneath the prayers was Cicero. Specifically, it was Cicero's De Publica, his great dialogue on government and the nature of the ideal state, written in the late 1st century before the Common Era and lost to scholarship since the early Middle Ages. The monks at Bobbio, probably sometime in the 7th century, had scraped a 5th century copy of Cicero off its parchment and written Augustine over the top. And in doing so they had accidentally preserved roughly 1/4 of a text that was otherwise almost entirely gone. The irony almost defies commentary. They erased Cicero to make room for Augustine, and the trace they left behind became the only substantial surviving portion of one of the most important political texts in Roman history. There's a lesson somewhere in all of this, and I've been trying to articulate it precisely for years without quite getting there. Something about the relationship between destruction and preservation. Something about how the things we lose are not always gone, and how the things we try to erase have a way of persisting. Something about the strange mercy of imperfect eraser. The monk in Constantinople who scraped Archimedes didn't mean to preserve him. He meant to replace him. But the scraping was never quite complete. And the parchment held its secret for 9 centuries, and we got the method back, and with it a window into a mind that may have changed the course of mathematics if only anyone had been listening. I find that both devastating, and in a very quiet way, hopeful. Not everything that gets written over is gone forever. Sometimes the ghost of it stays in the material, waiting for someone to come along with the right light. And this question of what gets preserved, what gets lost, and who gets to decide it runs like a thread through the entire story of monastic libraries. Because the next chapter of that story takes us away from the continental monasteries we've been exploring, away from the stone rooms and the scraped parchment and the careful hierarchies of what was sacred and what was merely tolerated. It takes us to the absolute edge of the known world, to islands of rock and cold water battered by Atlantic wind, where a handful of Irish monks did something that still astonishes historians who study it and created what may be the most extraordinary manuscripts in the history of the written word. That's where we're going next. Off the western coast of Scotland, there is a small island that most people alive today have never heard of. It is barely 3 miles long and 1 mile wide. The landscape is almost nothing. Flat rock, coarse grass, cold wind that comes straight off the Atlantic without anything to slow it down. The shore is gray and the sky changes moods in the time it takes to walk from one end of the island to the other. It is not the kind of place where you would expect civilization to be born. And yet in the year 563, a tall Irish monk named Columa in his own language, meaning dove of the church, landed on this island with 12 companions, looked around at the wind and the rock and the cold gray sea, and decided that this was exactly the place he needed to be. He built a monastery on the island of Iona. And what happened in that monastery and in the scattered island communities that grew out of it along the ragged Atlantic coast constitutes one of the most improbable creative explosions in the history of human art. I want to try to explain why the isolation mattered, because I think we almost always get this backwards. The conventional wisdom about creativity tends to run in one direction. Connection is good. Isolation is bad. The more networks, the more collaboration, the more cross-pollination of ideas, the better the work. And there's truth in that, certainly. But the Irish monastic tradition on these Atlantic islands tells a different story, or at least a more complicated one. These monks chose the harshest, most remote spots they could find, not out of accident or poverty, but deliberately. There is a phrase in the early Irish monastic tradition, desert in the sea, which captures the aspiration perfectly. Just as the early Christian desert fathers had gone into the Egyptian wilderness to strip away everything that was not essential, the Irish monks went to islands, to rock, to wind, to the edge of the known world. And in that stripping away, in that fierce, deliberate simplicity, something happened. The work became extraordinary. Now, I need to be careful here because there's a romantic version of this story that gets told in certain kinds of books. The idea of noble, solitary Irish monks heroically carrying civilization through the Dark Ages while the rest of Europe descended into chaos. That version is mostly wrong, or at least it's too simple. That the Irish monasteries were not isolated utopias. They were connected to the wider world, to Britain, to the continent, to the networks of scholarship we've been exploring throughout this story. Irish monks traveled extensively. The same German scholar Walifred Streo, writing in the 9th century, remarked that the custom of traveling into foreign parts had become almost second nature to the Irish. What was distinctive about the Irish tradition wasn't purity or isolation in some absolute sense. It was a particular combination of intense artistic ambition. A culture that valued learning and poetry, at least as highly as it valued prayer, and a physical and psychological environment that pushed certain kinds of creative work to extremes. When you're on a small island in the North Atlantic, surrounded by sea on all sides with nothing to do in the long winter evenings but work, the work becomes everything. It fills the space. It becomes the whole interior life. And the manuscripts produced in those island monasteries and in the communities that grew from them show it. Let me tell you about a single page. A single page in a single book. The book is the Book of Kells. You may have heard of it. It now lives in Trinity College, Dublin, and over 500,000 people visit it each year. But I want to try to describe what it actually is because I think the words illuminated manuscript do not come close to capturing the experience of encountering it. The Book of Kells is a copy of the 4 Gospels created by monks connected to the community founded by Columba, probably completed around the year 800. It is written on vellum 340 folios, the skins of approximately 180 calves. It took historians estimate the combined labor of at least 4 scribes and 3 major illuminating artists working over an indeterminate number of years. But none of those facts prepare you for a particular page. Page 34 on the right side. The scholars call it folio 34 recto. It is known more commonly as the Cairo page. Chi and Rho are the first 2 letters of the Greek word for Christ. And this page is at its most basic level just a large decorative monogram. Those 2 letters expanded to fill an entire page of the manuscript announcing a key moment in the text of Matthew's Gospel. That is the most basic description. Now, let me try to tell you what it actually looks like. The letters fill every inch of the page with ornaments so dense, so intricate, so microscopically detailed that scholars working with magnifying glasses have been studying it for more than a century, and are still finding things they missed before. There are spirals within spirals, knots that have no beginning and no end, braided patterns of such precise geometry that art historians have speculated the monks must have used compasses and rulers, and then embedded within all of that abstract complexity hidden in the curves and the corners like a secret left for the careful observer animals. A cat with 2 mice, one on either side, each mouse holding a communion wafer in its mouth. Theologians argue about whether this represents the unworthy receiving the Eucharist or the devil, waiting to catch sinners. But regardless of the interpretation, the image is there, hidden inside a monogram painted at a scale so small you need magnification to see it clearly. Nearby, an otter lying on its back holding a fish. Moths, angels, a human head with tousled yellow hair emerging from one of the letter's curves. In the corners of the page, 3 angels, their wings just barely distinguishable from the abstract knotwork around them. And underlying all of this, underneath every element of the design, a geometric structure of such complexity and precision that it would not look out of place in a modern discussion of mathematical symmetry. The 12th century scholar Giraldus Cambrinis, one of the first people to write about this manuscript after it was brought to his attention, said, and I am paraphrasing his Latin, that this was not the work of a human hand. It was, he concluded, the work of an angel. He wasn't being entirely metaphorical. Here's a question I genuinely wrestle with. What drives a person to that level of work? Not just competence, not just craftsmanship, but the kind of sustained, almost superhuman attention to detail that fills an entire page with patterns so fine they can only be seen with instruments that didn't exist yet in the 9th century. What were they reaching for? I've read a lot of scholarly discussions of this, and the answers range from it was an act of worship to it demonstrated the monastery's prestige to it was a competitive tradition among insular monastic communities, each trying to outdo the last. All of these are probably partly true, but I keep coming back to something simpler, something more human. These monks lived small, constrained lives, bounded by island shores, bounded by the hours of prayer, bounded by silence, by poverty, by vows that limited most of what a person could own or do or experience. And in the act of making something so impossibly intricate, something that contained more hidden detail than any single person could take in at once. Perhaps they were pushing back against those constraints, creating inside the bounded space of a page, an unbounded world. I have no way to know if that's true. It's a feeling more than a conclusion. But those hidden otter and cats and angels feel to me like messages from someone who was trying to say, look more carefully. There is more here than you can see. Now, for all the grandeur of the Book of Kells, my personal favorite thing from this entire Irish monastic tradition is something much smaller. Something almost embarrassingly small. It is a poem. 8 stanzas, 4 lines each, written in Old Irish, probably sometime in the 9th century. Found centuries later in a monastery in what is now Austria. Scratched into the margins of a notebook by an Irish monk who was supposed to be copying something else and clearly got distracted. The poem is about his cat. The cat's name was Ponga Ban. Ponga meaning something like fuller ban meaning white. So white Ponga, a white cat in a monastery in the middle of a long night's work. And the monk wrote in what Robin Flower, one of many poets to translate this poem, rendered as I and Ponga Ban my cat. It is a like task we are at hunting mice, is his delight, hunting words I sit all night. 8 stanzas comparing the monk's scholarly work. The hunting of meanings, the freeing of ideas trapped in old texts to his cat's patient. Precise hunting of mice. Both of them alone in a cold room, both of them completely absorbed, both of them in their different ways at peace. Better far than praise of men it is to sit with book and pen. Panganger bears me no ill will. He too plies his simple skill. This poem was written 1,200 years ago by a man whose name we will never know. In a monastery on an island or beside a river in Central Europe while a white cat sat nearby doing what cats do. And it is one of the most perfectly tender things I have ever read. It makes me think that the impulse behind all of this, the scriptorum, the manuscripts, the islands, the decades of painstaking work, was not always as grand as we make it sound. Sometimes it was just a person and a cat and a cold room and a problem to solve and the quiet companionship of 2 creatures each engaged in their own hunt for something worth catching. Can I ask you something since we're in that mood? Is there something in your own life that feels like what this monk describes? Some task you do alone that no one else might understand. The pleasure of that keeps you up late or gets you up early. That is its own reward. That's what Pangaban is really about, I think. Not scholarship, not monastic life, just the deep satisfaction of work that matters to you, done well in the company of things you love. The Irish monks understood that they built it into the very texture of their lives. But let me come back to the broader story because I've been sitting with something that I think is important and that we haven't quite named yet. The Irish monastic tradition. These islands and coastal monasteries and wandering scholars who spread across Europe from the 6th century to the 9th did something that no one planned and no one could have predicted. They became the channel through which a great deal of classical knowledge traveled from the ancient world into the early medieval one. Not as a conscious mission, not as a grand project, but because Irish monasteries, for reasons of history and culture and geography, ended up holding certain texts that no one else had held on to when continental Europe was in its most turbulent period, when Lombards and Franks and Vikings were moving across the landscape with the kind of focused energy that is bad for libraries. The island monasteries held steady. The sea was their moat. The isolation that might have looked like weakness was actually protection. And then, beginning in the late 6th century, the tide turned. The Irish monasteries sent monks outward to Scotland, to northern England, to the continent. Colum Barnes, a monk from the northern Irish monastery of Bangor, founded the great monastery of Bobbio in northern Italy around the year 614. Other Irish monks founded communities in what is now France, Germany, Switzerland. They brought their books with them. They brought their tradition of scholarship. They brought their peculiar, intense, slightly chaotic energy. And the continent, which are slowly losing its grip on ancient learning for generations, received a transfusion. This is the movement that eventually connects back to a figure we haven't yet fully explored in this story. A figure who took everything the Irish monasteries had seeded and applied to it the most powerful organizational force in medieval Europe. Because Columbus landed on Iona in 563 and just over 2 centuries later, a king decided he wanted to change the world. He summoned scholars from everywhere, from Ireland, from Britain, from Italy, from Spain. He built libraries and schools. He issued an order that reached into every monastery in his domain. His name was Charlemagne, and the story of what he did with the thread that those island monks had kept alive. How he turned a scattered tradition of monastic learning into something that looked almost like a system is a story about power and knowledge and the complicated relationship between the two. That story starts right now. Here is something that tends to surprise people when they first encounter it. The man who is widely credited with launching the most ambitious program of educational reform in medieval European history. The man who ordered every monastery and cathedral across his vast empire to establish schools, who summoned the greatest scholars of his age to his court, who effectively transformed the scattered tradition of monastic learning into something approaching a system that man could not write. Not properly, not in the way that his scholars wrote. According to Ahard the courtier who knew him personally and wrote the most detailed account of his life, Charlemagne kept writing tablets and blank pages under the pillow of his bed. In the quiet hours between sleep and prayer when no one was watching, he would take them out and practice forming letters, trying late in his life to teach his hand to do something his mind had long understood. But Einhard records the result without softening it. The effort begun too late in life met with little success. The greatest patron of learning in the medieval West went to his grave never having mastered the craft of writing. I find this detail almost unbearably human. And I think it tells us something important about what the Carolean Renaissance actually was and what it wasn't. Charlemagne Charles, the great king of the Franks from 768, emperor of the Romans from 800, was born around the year 742 into a world that was still working out what Europe was going to be. The Roman Empire in the West had been gone for nearly 3 centuries. The successor kingdoms that had divided the old imperial territory were by the 8th century settling into something more stable. But stability in this context meant constant negotiation of power between warriors, clerics, and local lords who all had their own ideas about how things should be run. Charlemagne was above everything else a conqueror. He fought campaigns in almost every direction over the course of his reign against the Saxons to the north and east in wars that lasted decades against the Lombards in Italy, against the Avars in Central Europe, against the Moors at the edge of his southern borders. He was a large man. Einhard records that his height was 7 times the length of his foot, which puts him at roughly 6 feet 4 inches in. Enormous for the era, and he was by every account physically imposing, personally ambitious, and possessed of an almost inexhaustible energy for administration. He was not, in the conventional sense, a man of letters. He could read, probably, though even that is disputed by some historians. He could certainly think his grasp of astronomy, of rhetoric, of theological argument, was genuine and evident to everyone who encountered him. But writing the craft of the scriptorum, the careful formation of letters on parchment, that was not his strength, and yet he understood with a clarity that few rulers of his era matched that knowledge and power were not separate things. Here is the problem he was actually trying to solve, because I think we lose it when we frame this purely as a story about learning and culture. Charlemagne ruled an empire that stretched from the Atlantic coast of what is now Spain and France through the Rhine and Danube valleys all the way east into what is now Germany, Austria, and Hungary. It was the largest political entity in Western Europe since the fall of Rome. And the central challenge of governing such a territory, before printing, before reliable roads, before anything resembling a modern communication system, was this: how do you make sure that the people representing you in distant places are actually doing what you want? The answer in practice required literate people, officials who could read and understand a royal decree, priests who could accurately administer sacraments according to the authorized form, not some garbled version they'd learned by rote, from someone who'd learned it by rote from someone else. Charlemagne had discovered through bitter experience that many of the clergy in his empire could barely read Latin. Some of them were performing baptisms using words that had been corrupted through generations of imperfect transmission. Words that, by the strictest theological interpretation, might not count as valid baptisms at all. That was not for him a minor educational concern. That was a crisis of governance dressed up as a spiritual problem. In the year 789, Charlemagne issued one of the most consequential documents in the history of European education. It was called the Admonio Generalis, the General Admonition, and it consisted of 82 chapters covering everything from the moral conduct of the clergy to the proper form of baptism to the correct way to calculate Easter. But buried within those 82 chapters, specifically in chapter 72, was an order that changed the intellectual landscape of Europe. Every bishop, every abbot, every monastery and cathedral in the Frankish Empire was commanded to establish a school. Not a great university, not a center of advanced scholarship, just a school, a place where boys could learn to read, where the Psalms could be taught, where grammar and singing and the basic arts of literacy would be maintained. It sounds modest when I say it like that, but multiply that order across the entire Carolingian Empire, across hundreds of monasteries and cathedral communities stretching from the Atlantic to the edge of the Slavic lands, and you begin to understand what it meant. In a single document, Charlemagne had turned the institutional church into the infrastructure of literacy for an entire continent. Now the practical implementation was far messier than the decree made it sound. Many monasteries didn't have qualified teachers. Some barely had books. Enforcement was uneven and depended heavily on the local bishop or abbot, who may or may not have cared about the emperor's educational program. This is always the gap between legislation and reality, and medieval Europe was no exception. But here's what the Admonica Generalis set in motion, even imperfectly a cultural expectation after 789. The idea that a monastery should maintain both a library and a school, that these were basic requirements of an institution calling itself a house of God, became normalized in a way it had not been before. And to fill those schools, to supply those libraries, to produce the standardized texts that the emperor's decree required. The scriptor that we've been exploring in this story had to scale up, had to produce more, had to work faster and more efficiently than they ever had before. The Carolingian era produced more surviving manuscripts than the entire previous history of Christian Europe combined. Approximately 7,000 manuscripts survive from the century between 750 and 850, far more than from any comparable earlier period. 7,000 manuscripts from a century and a half. That is the measure of what one document, one imperial command set in motion. And to standardize all of this, to make sure that the texts being produced across a vast empire were actually legible and consistent, Charlemagne needed something he didn't yet have: a common script. Because in the 8th century, you could walk from one monastery to another in different parts of the Frankish Empire and find writing styles so different from each other that a scribe from one region might struggle to read the work of a scribe from another. Regional variations had accumulated over centuries until the written word itself had fragmented into dozens of local dialects of hand. The solution that emerged from the monasteries working under Alcuin's influence, and scholars still debate exactly who deserves credit for it, was a script of such elegant clarity that would not just standardize writing across the Carolingian world, it would indirectly give us the alphabet you're reading these words in. Right now, it was called Carolingian minuscule, a clean, rounded, clearly separated letter form that made texts dramatically easier to read than the cramped and tangled scripts that preceded it. The innovation of Carolingian minuscule was not just aesthetic, it was functional. Clear separation between words, something that Roman scribes had actually not always bothered with writing in continuous streams of letters, made texts accessible to a far wider range of readers. The learning curve for a new student dropped significantly. And then the story takes one of those long, strange loops that history sometimes takes. When Renaissance scholars a full 600 years later were hunting through monastery libraries for ancient texts, they found Carolingian-era manuscripts written in this clean, clear hand, and they assumed incorrectly that this was how ancient Romans had actually written, that this was the authentic classical script. So they adopted it as the model for their own humanist handwriting. And when printers in the 15th century looked for a hand to use as the basis for movable type for the typefaces that would eventually become the fonts you are reading in this century, they modeled them on the humanist hand, which was itself modeled on Carolingian minuscule, which was developed in the monasteries of the 8th century to make Charlemagne's imperial decree legible. The letters you're looking at right now have their shape because of a decision made in a Frankish monastery about 1,200 years ago. Now I want to come back to the man at the center of all this, because I think he deserves a closer look than he usually gets. Alcuin of York, born around the year 735 in Northumbria, northern England, educated at the Cathedral School in York, a school whose intellectual lineage ran directly through the Venerable Bede, one of the greatest scholars of the early medieval period. Alcuin eventually became the head of that school building, its library, into one of the finest in Britain. Then in 782, at the age of roughly 47, not a young man by the standards of his era, he accepted Charlemagne's invitation and came to Aachen. And what he found there was, by his later account, almost chaotic. The court was intellectually ambitious, but academically rough. Charlemagne himself was voracious in his curiosity. He studied grammar with one teacher, rhetoric and astronomy, with Alcuin arithmetic with Einhard. But the underlying fabric of educated personnel across the empire was thin and inconsistent. Alcuin spent roughly 14 years at Aachen transforming the palace school from a modest training ground for royal children into what one scholar has called the intellectual nucleus of the Carolingian world. He taught Charlemagne's sons, his daughters, the young courtiers, the clergy attached to the palace chapel. He gave them all nicknames, a practice that has always struck me as both endearing and slightly terrifying in the way that being renamed by your brilliant teacher can be. Charlemagne himself was called David the Biblical King Scholar. Alcuin was Albinus or Flaccus. Einhard the historian was called Bezalel, the craftsman of the temple. The court had something of a college atmosphere about it, which is odd and wonderful when you remember that this was the same court from which campaigns were being directed across half of Europe. Let me stop here for a moment and ask you something, because there's a tension in this part of the story that I find genuinely interesting. Charlemagne's educational program, the Admonio Generalis, the palace school, the library expansion, the script standardization, all of this produced real and lasting benefits for the preservation and transmission of knowledge. There's no question about that. But what was it for? Because when you look closely at the motivations, when you read the decree itself, when you read Alcuin's letters about why this all mattered, the honest answer is more complicated than for the love of learning. It was for control. A literate clergy was a controllable clergy, one that could receive and properly execute royal orders. Standardized texts meant standardized doctrine, which meant a church that was aligned with imperial policy. Schools produced administrators. Libraries produced textual authority. Knowledge in the Carolingian framework was not a neutral good. It was a tool of governance. Does that make it less valuable? Does knowing the political motive behind an educational revolution change the value of what it produced? I've thought about this for a long time, and my honest answer is no. The motivation doesn't determine the outcome. The 7,000 manuscripts produced in the Carolingian era carried genuine knowledge regardless of why they were made. The children who learned to read in those monastery schools gained something real regardless of what their emperor wanted from their literacy. Power and learning have always been entangled. The question is whether the entanglement produces something worth having. In this case, I think it did. And there's a final dimension to the caroling achievement that I haven't mentioned yet, one that leads directly into the next part of this story. The schools and libraries that the Admin Generalis created did not exist in isolation. They were almost immediately in contact with each other. Books moved between them. Scholars traveled. Texts were borrowed, copied, returned. The network that had existed informally among monasteries for generations suddenly had a kind of institutional backing, a shared standard, a common script that made communication across distance possible in a new way. What the Carolingian era created somewhat unintentionally as the byproduct of an administrative decree was the closest thing the medieval world ever had to a system of interconnected libraries. And how that system actually worked. How books moved between monasteries who could borrow what happened when someone didn't give the book back, and what extraordinary little details about ordinary medieval life survive in the records of that borrowing. That is a story about the hidden social world of monastic knowledge that almost nobody ever tells. That's exactly where we're going next. Somewhere in the final pages of a 9th century manuscript currently held in a library in Wuhlenbuhl, Germany, there is a list. Not a grand document, not a theological treatise, just a list written in a quick practical hand on the last pages of a commentary on the Gospel of Matthew in the way that someone might jot a note in the back of a notebook. It is the borrowing record of the monastery at Wissenamber, and it is quietly one of the most intimate and revealing documents to survive from the early medieval world. Because when you read this list, when scholars have painstakingly decoded the names and the scratched-out entries and the little notations beside each borrowed book, you discover something that completely overturns the standard picture of medieval monastic life. The monasteries were not islands. They were not closed, self-contained fortresses of learning where a few robed scholars hoarded their manuscripts away from the outside world. They were nodes in a living network, and that network, in ways that nobody planned, and that the monks themselves might not have fully recognized, functioned as something strikingly similar to what we would now call a public library. Let me walk you through the Wissembourg list because the details matter. The monastery at Wissembourg was a Benedictine community in what is now the Alsace region of France. During the 9th and 10th centuries, it maintained a library and apparently a lending practice because the list records not just what the library held, but who borrowed what. Names appear with books noted beside them, local priests, nearby clergy, and then, and this is the part that surprises most people when they encounter it for the first time, women. A certain Lady Luitgard borrowed a psalter. Another Luitgard borrowed one as well. A woman identified only as wife of Reinbold borrowed a text. The widow of Gerald borrowed another. Think about what this means. These women had standing in the community sufficient to be trusted with books. They could read. They were known to the monks by name, and the library served them as readily as it served the local priests and scholars. The standard narrative of medieval women as uniformly excluded from the life of the mind is complicated, not destroyed, but genuinely complicated by a name scratched in the back of a manuscript that has survived for over 1,000 years. Lady Luitgard borrowed a psalter. We don't know if she ever returned it, but we know she existed and we know she read. And then there's Lantred. Lanfred borrowed an antiphony, a book of religious chants. His name appears in the list, but here is the telling detail: his name was scratched out. In the system, the Wissembourg monks used a name scratched from the borrowing record meant that the item had been returned. Lanfred, to his credit, gave the book back. Not everyone did. Some names in the list remain unscratched. Some books, judging by their absence from later inventories, never came home. A manuscript that had taken months of labor to produce the skins of dozens of animals, the careful work of scribes and illuminators, the resources of an entire community borrowed by someone whose name is still legible on a page, whose conscience apparently did not extend to the return of borrowed goods. Now, here's a question I find genuinely funny in a dark way. What do you do when a borrower doesn't return your book? The monks had thought about this. The medieval answer to non-returning borrowers was not overdue fines. It was not strongly worded letters. It was not a collection agency. It was a curse, a real detailed, beautifully specific curse written directly into the pages of the book itself, designed to follow it wherever it went. These are called book curses, and there are hundreds of them still surviving in medieval manuscripts from across Europe. And they are, without question, some of the most entertaining documents in the historical record. Let me read you a few from a manuscript held at the Arstein Abbey, probably written sometime in the 12th or 13th century. Book of the Abbey of Saints Mary and Nicholas of Arstein. If anyone take away this book, let him die the death. Let him be fried in a pan. Let the falling sickness and fever seize him. Let him be broken on the wheel and hanged. Amen. That's quite comprehensive, honestly. You've got your execution options, your medical afflictions, your apparatus of public punishment, all in one sentence. Efficient from a manuscript at the monastery of St. Gall written around the year 880. May no one believe that I have ever been taken, but that happily this place I have never forsaken. Yet may no one doubt that the wrath of God upon him will fall if he essays to take me from the confines of St. Gall. The book is speaking in its own voice, which is a creative choice I deeply respect. And from a 13th century manuscript at the Vatican Library, which starts with a pleasant dedication and then accelerates rapidly, whoever takes away this volume out with his eyes. That one gets directly to the point. Now, to be clear, these curses were not, as far as we know, enforceable in any legal sense. They were essentially strongly worded copyright notices deployed by people who genuinely believed that divine punishment was a credible deterrent. Whether they worked is another question. The books that didn't come back suggest they worked imperfectly. But the curses themselves tell us something important, something beyond the obvious point about how valuable manuscripts were. They tell us that books traveled, that they moved from hand to hand, from community to community, from monastery to lay household and back again. You don't need a curse against theft if no one is ever allowed near the book. The curse are proof of a network. There's another security measure worth mentioning because it's both more practical and more poignant than a curse. In certain larger and wealthier libraries, particularly in England, where a good number of them survive to this day. The most valuable manuscripts were chained, literally chained. Iron chains fixed to the coverboards of the books and running to a rod on the shelf long enough that you could take the book off the shelf and read it at a lectern, but not long enough that you could walk away with it. If you've ever visited Hereford Cathedral in England or Merton College in Oxford, you can still see the surviving chained libraries rooms full of old books, each trailing its iron chain like a very quiet, very ancient library of anchored knowledge. This detail always catches my imagination. All that labor, all those years of copying and illuminating and binding, and the final safeguard was a piece of iron. It is the most medieval solution possible. Trust in the divine, but also chain it to the shelf. Now I want to talk about the broader system that these lending lists and these chains and these curses represent, because there is a common misunderstanding about medieval libraries that I think is worth correcting directly. The popular images of monasteries as isolated treasure vaults, closed institutions that hoarded knowledge behind walls, lending reluctantly or not at all accessible only to the initiated few within their own communities. That image is not entirely wrong. There were certainly monasteries that were protective to the point of paranoia about their collections. Some books were simply too rare or too fragile to be lent under any circumstances. But it is far from the whole picture. The Visbor list shows us lay people borrowing books, local priests who needed a missal to perform the Mass, women who wanted a palter for private devotion, people who lived near the monastery but were not part of it, building their reading lives around access to a collection they did not own. Early lending lists from other communities show books traveling between monasteries across significant distances. Monasteries borrowed exemplars, the manuscript they would copy from communities that might be weeks of travel away, with the understanding that the book would be returned or that a copy would be made and the copy provided as a kind of payment. The historian and scholar Megan Tidmarsh, who wrote an article in Time magazine that I keep returning to, describes this as a system based not on transactions, but on relationships, a network held together by trust, mutual obligation, and the shared sense that knowledge was a common good, even when the physical books were private property. Do you have a book on your shelf that belongs to someone else? Something borrowed maybe years ago that somehow never quite made it back. I'm not going to judge you. The Visenborg list has at least one Lantre and probably several names whose scratching out has not survived. But think about what you would need to feel to write, "Let him be fried in a pan" at the beginning of a book before lending it out. You would need to believe that the book was worth more than money, worth more than social awkwardness, worth more than the friendship of the person you were sending it to. The medieval monks believed that with a depth we probably can't quite match. Every manuscript in their library represented months of human labor. The skins of dozens of animals' pigments that had traveled thousands of miles. These were not replaceable objects. There was no second copy available on request. And yet they lent them anyway. I think that's worth sitting with. They lent the irreplaceable things. There is one more dimension to the monastic network that I want to name before we move on, because it connects directly to a part of this story that almost always gets overlooked. The lending lists of monasteries like Wissenborg are among the very few surviving records that document women's literacy and women's relationship to books in the early medieval period. Lady Lutgard and the widow of Gerald don't appear in chronicles. They don't appear in theological debates. They don't appear in most histories of medieval intellectual life. They appear in a borrowing record. And that borrowing record tells us that they could read, that they wanted to read, that they took a book from a monastery's collection and carried it home and kept it for whatever period seemed right to them. And then, presumably, since their names appear to have been scratched from the list, brought it back. Women were part of this network. Not marginally, not incidentally, but because the evidence for their participation is scattered often in documents that are not considered important. History lists, receipts, ledger entries, the backs of manuscripts. It rarely makes it into the main narrative. That invisibility is its own kind of eraser, not as dramatic as scraping ink from parchment, but with similar effects on what we know and what we assume. The fuller story of women and learning in the medieval monastic world, the schoolgirls and the abuses and the women who wrote theology and music and medical texts, deserves its own chapter, because there is a real letter written by a young girl to her teacher in a monastery of canonesses sometime in the 9th century. She's trying to negotiate staying up late. She invokes the honor of scholarly dedication. She appeals to the teacher's sympathy. She promises, if allowed, to keep her candle burning through the night. that she will not stop reading or singing until the morning comes. And the teacher, a woman called Felon, appears to have said yes because just below the letter in a different hand, there is a short response in Latin. 2 words, valet in domino, go with the Lord. That schoolgirl's name is lost. Her teacher's name survives only in that 2-word reply. But the dynamic between them, the hunger for learning, the mentorship, the negotiation between ambition and institutional constraint that is entirely recognizable. And the fact that it was preserved at all is one of the quiet miracles of the monastic world we've been exploring. That world is where we're headed now. That letter we ended on, the one from the girl who wanted to stay up all night reading, has stayed with me since I first read about it. We don't know her name. We don't know what she looked like or what she eventually became, or whether she used that hard-won candle at night to read something extraordinary, or simply fell asleep over the Psalms 2 hours in. But we know she asked, and we know her teacher, a woman named Felon, said yes. And somehow on the back of that exchange, in the very manuscript that contained her school exercises, that small negotiation survived 11 or 12 centuries. 2 words of Latin, go with the Lord. I keep coming back to how much history is actually just this. Not the grand documented decisions of kings and popes, but the small moments that were almost lost, entirely preserved by accident in the margins of something else, waiting for someone patient enough to notice them. The story of women and learning in the medieval monastic world is full of moments like that. And it is a story that has been, for most of recorded history, systematically undertold. Let me start with a misconception because I think it's important to name it clearly before we build on it. The popular picture of medieval intellectual life, the one embedded in most casual histories and in most people's imagination, is an almost entirely male picture. Monks in their cells, male abbots debating theology, men in universities arguing over Aristotle. Women appear occasionally, if at all, as patrons or recipients, people who funded the work or received its benefits, but who were not themselves producers of knowledge. This picture is not entirely wrong. The institutional structures of medieval learning did favor men in profound and often decisive ways. Most monasteries with significant libraries and scriptoria were male. Most of the positions of formal intellectual authority were held by men. Most of what we consider the major texts of the medieval period were written by men. But the picture is radically incomplete. And the incompleteness is not an accident. It is the accumulated result of centuries of historical choices about what counted as important, what was worth preserving, and whose contributions deserve to be included in the story. Women were there. They were writing. They were teaching. They were producing manuscripts that have survived. And when you look for them, when you actually go looking, rather than assuming they weren't there, you find them in place after place, century after century. The clearest way to see this is to start not with the most famous name, but with an institution, the Abbey of Chelles. Founded in the 7th century, not far from Paris. Chelles was a Benedictine monastery for women that became, during the 8th century, one of the most productive scriptor in the Carolinian world. When we talked earlier in this story about Charlemagne and his educational program, we were talking about a movement that drew on many institutions, and Chelles was one of them. The abbeys of Chelles during one of its most productive periods was Gisela, a name that may be familiar to some of you because she was the sister of Charlemagne himself. Under her leadership and that of her successors, the nuns of Chelles produced manuscripts, real, substantial, important manuscripts. And here is the detail that matters. Some of those manuscripts survive with colophons, the scribal notes at the end of a manuscript, identifying who made it, that name female scribes explicitly. In a world where women's contributions to intellectual work were so routinely invisible, those siphons are extraordinary names. Women's names attached to specific books that still exist. Not, this was probably done by a woman. Not, scholars have suggested female involvement. Actual signatures. But I want to spend most of this part of the story on 2 women whose work was so substantial, so undeniable, and so revealing of what the monastic world made possible for women when it chose to. That they deserve more than a footnote. The first lived in the 10th century. Her name was Prosvita. The name itself comes from the Old Saxon and it means strong voice. Whether she gave herself that name or it was given to her, it fits with an almost too perfect appropriateness. Vither was a canonist at the Abbey of Gandersheim in Lower Saxony. founded in the year 850 by the ancestors of the Ottonian dynasty that ruled the German lands in the 10th century. Ganderheim was not a conventional nunnery. The women who lived there took vows of chastity and obedience, but not poverty. They had access to a substantial library. They studied classical literature alongside scripture. Virgil of Vid-Terran. They lived relatively comfortable intellectual lives in a community that unusually for its era was governed entirely by women and answered directly to the papacy, not to a local bishop. Ratsvita read Terence deeply carefully, and she was annoyed. In his defense, as one scholar has noted, Christianity had not yet been invented when Terence was writing. But that didn't make his female characters any less irritating to a 10th century Cancaronus with strong opinions. Terran's women were courtesan shrews, passive victims of the scheming of men. His comedies turned on the desires and difficulties of young men with women as either obstacles or prizes. Vither looked at these plays, which were widely read in her world, used as models of classical Latin style in exactly the kind of monastic education she had received, and decided she could do better. So she wrote 6 plays in Latin modeled explicitly on Terran's dramatic form and comic style, but featuring virtuous women who chose principle over survival, who outwitted their persecutors who refused to be diminished. She wrote one play called Delicious, in which a Roman governor tries to seize 3 Christian women, and by divine intervention ends up making love to cooking pots by mistake, while the women watch baffled and increasingly amused. It is by any standard a comedy. It is specifically a comedy at the expense of male self-importance. She noted in the preface to her work that she had often hesitated with a blush on my cheeks through modesty about writing such scenes. Then she wrote them anyway. Her manuscript disappeared into a monastery library. It was found in the year 1494 by a German humanist named Conrad Keltis in the library of St. Emmeram in Regensburg. He published it in 151 with illustrations by Ulrich Dürer. It had been sitting there for over 500 years unread by anyone who thought to tell the broader story of medieval drama. Here is a question that matters. If Conrad Keltis had not gone looking in that particular library in that particular year, if the manuscript had been one of the countless thousands that simply didn't survive, how many more centuries would have passed before anyone asked whether women in the medieval period had been writing plays? Now, let me take you forward about 150 years to someone who could not be ignored even in her own lifetime. Though the mechanisms by which her voice was acceptable to the institutional church are themselves worth examining carefully. Her name was Hildegard, born around the year 1098 into a noble family in the Rhineland. She was sent at the age of 8 to live with a holy woman named Judah, an anchorite, a person who had chosen to be literally enclosed in a small room attached to a monastery sealed in by masonry to spend her life in prayer. Hildegard received her education from UT, and when Judah died in the year 1136, the community of nuns that had gathered around her elected Hildegard as their leader. She was 38 years old, and she had been carrying something in silence for most of her life since childhood. She later wrote she'd been receiving visions, not dreams, not metaphors, what she described as floods of light voices, images of extraordinary complexity that carried meaning she could not quite articulate in ordinary language. For decades, she told almost no one. The exceptions were her mentor, Judah, and a monk named Wulmer, who had been her teacher and friend since her youth. Then in 1141, she later described it as though God spoke to her directly and told her, "Stop keeping this to yourself. Write it down." She obeyed, but she obeyed strategically. She did not simply begin writing and send manuscripts into the world on her own authority. A woman claiming direct divine revelation in the 12th century was on extremely thin ice. The institutional church had very definite ideas about the kinds of people to whom God revealed things, and those ideas did not typically include abuses in German convents. So Hildegard sent portions of what she had written to Bernard of Clairvaux, the most respected theologian in Europe at that moment. She asked for his assessment. He endorsed what he read cautiously. The endorsement was passed up the chain. At the Synod of Trier in 1147 and 48, Pope Eugenius III read portions of the work. He gave it his blessing. That blessing was in practical terms the authorization that made everything else possible. With papal endorsement, Hildegard was free, and what she did with that freedom is staggering. The work she completed in 1151 or 52 was called Scivias, a condensed form of the Latin phrase stovas dominating know the ways of the Lord. It describes 26 visions in 3 sections with 35 illuminated illustrations miniatures that Hildegard supervised personally, and which bear no resemblance to any conventional medieval manuscript illumination tradition. They are strange and vivid and unmistakably individual. She followed it with a morality play called the Ordo Virtutum, the Play of Virtues, which is the oldest surviving medieval morality play and the only medieval musical drama to survive complete with its composer identified. Hildegard wrote the text. She wrote the music. She directed its performance by her own nuns. She wrote treatises on medicine and natural science, 2 substantial volumes covering the medicinal properties of plants, stones, fish, birds, and metals, as well as a detailed text on the causes and treatments of disease. Modern medical historians have taken these seriously as documents of 12th century medical practice. She wrote nearly 400 letters addressed to popes and emperors and bishops and abbesses and ordinary people seeking her counsel. Some of those letters are corrections and rebukes she wrote to the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, calling him an infant and a madman when he was engaged in a controversy about which of 2 rival popes was legitimate. He was the official protector of her monastery at the time. She wrote it anyway. She undertook 4 preaching tours, traveling through the German lands and giving public sermons which women were formerly not supposed to do. She invented a language, an actual invented language with its own alphabet of 23 letters and a vocabulary of approximately 900 words. She called it the lingua ignota, the unknown language. We have no idea what it was for. Some scholars think it was a mystical or devotional practice. Some think it was used for private communication within her community. Whatever its purpose, the sheer fact of it that a 12th century abbey sat down and invented an entire language as a kind of side project says something about the quality of mind that the monastic world had housed and nurtured and then in her case could no longer contain. I want to stop here and ask you something directly because I think this question is worth sitting with. When we call Hildegard extraordinary, when we describe her as exceptional, as one of a kind, as someone who broke the mold, are we paying her a compliment, or are we participating in a kind of historical sleight of hand? Because here is what I actually believe, having spent time with this material. Hildegard was not exceptional because she were a woman who did things women supposedly didn't do. She was exceptional because she had unusual talent, unusual drive, and an unusual combination of institutional access, social status, strategic intelligence, and historical luck. But Frzvita writing plays in the 10th century, the nuns of Shell signing their names to manuscripts, the schoolgirl negotiating with Phelan for 1 more hour of reading, the women in the Wissenamberg borrowing list whose names tell us they could read. These were not the exceptions to a rule. They were evidence of a much broader reality that has been systematically underdocumented, understudied, and undercelebrated. The monastic world gave some women under particular conditions with sufficient social status and institutional support access to something that the broader medieval world rarely offered them. Books learning the possibility of becoming someone whose thoughts were worth recording. Not for all women, not easily, not without constant negotiation with the structures of authority that surrounded them. But it happened. It happened more often than we were taught. And the evidence is there in the manuscripts themselves, in the borrowing lists, in the colophons, with women's names in the plays and visions and invented languages of people who refused to be silent. The story of women in the monastic library is ultimately the story of what happens when an institution that was designed to exclude you also by its very nature contains the tools of your inclusion. Books don't care who reads them, and that fact, that quietly subversive, structurally inescapable fact, is what makes the history of monastic learning so much richer and more complicated than the standard version usually lets on. But there is another part of this richness that we haven't touched yet. Another strand of the story that runs parallel to everything we've been exploring. One that involves a completely different civilization, a different language, a different theological tradition, and a question that generations of historians have argued about passionately. Did the monasteries of Christian Europe actually save the knowledge of the ancient world on their own, or did they have help? The answer is complicated, and the complication points us toward one of the most unlikely collaborations in intellectual history. The bridge that connected the Greek philosophical tradition to medieval Europe, built not in a monastery but in a city that was at the time the most sophisticated place on earth. That city was Baghdad. And the story of how Aristotle traveled from Athens to Baghdad to Toledo to Paris and what got added and what got lost along the way is where we're going next. Baghdad in the year 830. Try to hold that image for a moment, not as a word on a page, but as a physical place, a city of over 1 million people, which made it the largest city on earth at that time by a considerable margin. A city of wide canals, covered markets, 3 palaces, dozens of mosques, and a smell of cinnamon and cedar and booking hanging in the warm air. At its center, under the patronage of the 7th Abbasid Caliph, a man named Al-Mamun, who was by all accounts genuinely obsessed with knowledge, was an institution that later became known in the West as the House of Wisdom. And here is where I want to slow down, because this is one of those corners of history where the popular story is both true and misleading at the same time, where the real version is actually more interesting than the simplified one. If you're willing to sit with the complexity for a few minutes, the simplified story of the House of Wisdom goes something like this. When the Roman Empire collapsed and Western Europe entered the so-called Dark Ages, the great texts of ancient Greece were lost. The monks preserved a little, mostly the religious and philosophical works that suited Christian theology. But Aristotle, Galen, Euclid, most of the scientific and philosophical tradition of antiquity vanished from European awareness. Then the Islamic world swept in, translated everything from Greek into Arabic, expanded on it brilliantly, and eventually passed it back to Europe through Spain. Without Baghdad, there would have been no Renaissance. Without Arab scholars, Aristotle would be a name attached to nothing. That story is often told as a simple transfer Greek to Arabic to Latin to us. But here is where it gets complicated in ways I find endlessly fascinating. First, the translators at the House of Wisdom were not for the most part Arabs in the ethnic sense. The most productive translator of the entire Baghdad translation movement was a man named Hunayn ibn Ishaq. He was born around 809 and he translated 6 works into Arabic or Syriac. During his lifetime, he translated the entire medical collection of Galen, 129 works of Galen alone. He traveled to Zantine territories specifically to hunt down manuscripts that had not yet been found. He was by any measure one of the most important intellectual laborers of the medieval world. And he was a Christian, specifically a Nestorian Christian from a community of Arab Christians that had been literate in multiple languages for generations. Beside him worked the Bet ibn Qurra, a Sabian, a member of a pagan star-worshipping religious community from northern Mesopotamia, who translated works of Apollonius Archimedes, Euclid, and Ptolemy. Al-Kindi the philosopher was a Muslim of Arab descent and was one of the few ethnic Arabs involved in the core translation work. The Banu Musa brothers Muhammad Ahmed and Al-Hassan were Persian Muslims who funded translations as well as conducting their own scientific research. The House of Wisdom, at its core intellectual heart, was not a monument to any single culture or faith. It was a working collaboration between Christians, Muslims, Sabians, Jews, and Persians. People who, in other contexts, might have had very little to say to each other, brought together by a shared conviction that these texts were worth understanding. There is something about that fact that I think deserves more attention than it usually gets. Now, there is one story about the origins of the translation movement in Baghdad that I want to share with you because it has the quality of a dream literally. There is an account that Caliph Al-Mun's interest in Greek philosophy was ignited by a vision he had one night in which Aristotle appeared to him. The philosopher was described as sitting on a golden throne, and the two of them had a long conversation about the nature of reason and the relationship between religion and philosophical inquiry. Whether this vision was real, invented, or strategically reported after the fact to explain and legitimize a policy that had already been decided for other reasons, historians debate this. I cannot say, but I love that it exists, because it captures something true about the spirit of the translation movement, even if the specific dream is apocryphal. Al-Mamun was genuinely fascinated by Aristotle. He sent delegations to Constantinople to negotiate for manuscripts. He paid translators by the weight of gold equal to the weight of what they produced, a payment system that must have incentivized comprehensiveness rather than brevity. He demanded that ancient scientific texts be found wherever they could be found. One account records that camel loads of old manuscripts were discovered in a pagan Greek temple that has been locked and abandoned since the arrival of Christianity. Its contents gnawed at by pests for centuries, waiting for someone to think they were worth opening. Even if that detail is embellished, it captures something real. These texts were out there scattered across the eastern Mediterranean in various states of neglect and survival. And someone with sufficient will and resources could find them. Al-Mamun had both. So the Arabic translation movement was real, substantial, and transformative. The House of Wisdom was a genuine intellectual powerhouse, whatever its exact institutional form. The scholars who worked in and around it produced translations that were, as one historian has put it, not just copies but interpretations. They engaged with the texts, corrected them, expanded them, added commentary, pushed back against conclusions they found wrong. Hune Abanik described his process in detail in his own writings, and it is illuminating. He would not simply translate a text he had never seen before. He would first collect multiple manuscripts of the same work, compare them, identify corruptions and interpolations, establish what the text actually said, and only then translate. This is rigorous scholarly method, not preservation as museum keeping, but preservation as active intellectual engagement. The Arabic commentators on Aristotle al-Kindi, al-Farabi ibn Sina, whom the West would call Avisa ibn Rushd, whom the West would call Averroes, did not just transmit Aristotle. They argued with him, they developed him, they pushed his ideas into territories he'd never explored. By the time those works eventually reached Western Europe, they arrived carrying centuries of Muslim philosophical commentary woven into them. And here is where the story becomes something genuinely structurally extraordinary. Because the path from Baghdad to Western Europe did not go directly. It went through Spain. In the year 711, Muslim forces crossed from North Africa into the Iberian Peninsula and within a few years had conquered most of what is now Spain and Portugal. For the next several centuries, the Iberian Peninsula was home to one of the most culturally complex societies in the medieval world. A place where Christians, Muslims, and Jews lived in varying degrees of proximity and interaction, where libraries held texts in Arabic, Hebrew, and Latin, and where the intellectual inheritance of multiple civilizations sat side by side on the same shelves. Toledo, an ancient city at the geographic heart of the peninsula, fell back into Christian hands in the year 1085 when Alonso VI of Castile took it from the weakened Moorish rulers. And there, in the libraries of the old Muslim city, Christian scholars found something extraordinary. They found Arabic texts, hundreds of them, containing, among other things, the works of Aristotle, not just the small portions that had trickled through in Latin translations and partial compilations, but the full Aristotle preserved in Arabic annotated with centuries of commentary. They found the astronomy of Toy, the medicine of Galen, the mathematics of Euclid and Al-Khwarizmi. They found treatises on optics and algebra and astronomy that simply did not exist in any Latin form. And the scholarly hunger was immediate. A man named Gerard of Cremona walked into this picture, and his story has always seemed to me like one of the most human and honest descriptions of intellectual motivation I've ever encountered. Gerard was an Italian scholar born around the year 114. He had read everything available to him in Latin. He was competent, well-educated, and deeply dissatisfied because there was a text he could not find. Tomi's Alma Majest, the great Greek treatise on mathematical astronomy, which had been known in the ancient world and was constantly referenced by later writers, existed in Arabic translation in Toledo's libraries, but had never been rendered into Latin in a form accessible to Western scholars. Gerard went to Toledo, he taught himself Arabic, he translated the Almastist, and then apparently he couldn't stop, he stayed in Toledo for most of the rest of his life. When he died in the year 1187, his students compiled a list of what he had translated. The list contains 87 works including Aristotle's Physics on the Heavens, on Generation and Corruption and Meteorology, Archimedes, Euclid's Elements of Geometry, works of Al-Kindi on Optics, Al-Khwarizm on Algebra, Garland. 87 books from Arabic into Latin by one man in one city in roughly 50 years. Now think about what that means for the monasteries of Europe. Because the moment those Latin translations became available, and Toledo was not the only translation center, though it was the most prolific, the libraries of the European monasteries faced something they had not experienced for centuries. New books, books containing ideas that had not been available in Latin before. Ideas about how the physical world worked, about the nature of the soul, about the relationship between faith and reason. Some of these ideas were dangerous by the standards of the medieval church. Aristotle, as filtered through Averroes's commentaries, seemed to imply that the world was eternal, that it had always existed and had not been created. He implied things about the relationship between the individual soul and universal intellect that sat uncomfortably with Christian doctrine about personal salvation. The University of Paris condemned portions of Aristotle in the year 1210 and again through the middle of the 13th century. Studying certain texts was prohibited, which, as we have already established in this story, is excellent advertising. Let me stop here and address directly the question I teased at the end of the last part of our story. The question of who really saved ancient knowledge. Was it the Christian monasteries? Was it the Arab translators? Was it the Byzantine scholars who kept the original Greek texts alive in Constantinople while Western Europe lost Greek as a working language? And the honest answer is yes. All three in different ways at different times with different motivations, often without awareness of each other's contributions. The monastic scribes copied Latin texts and kept them alive through centuries when secular literacy collapsed in the West. Without them, Virgil and Cicero and much of late Roman literature would be gone. The Byzantine scholars preserved the original Greek of Aristotle, Plato, and the scientific corpus. Without Constantinople, we would know those authors only through Arabic translations and Latin reransations of Arabic. The Arabic translators did something the European monasteries largely did not do. They engaged with the texts as living intellectual problems, subjected them to critical analysis, expanded them, argued with them. They took the Greek inheritance and made it something new and larger. And then Toledo acted as the junction point, the place where all three streams met and were poured into a form that the emerging universities of medieval Europe could receive. Here's what I find myself returning to when I try to make sense of this whole long story. Knowledge does not save itself. It does not naturally persist. It does not flow automatically from one civilization to the next. Every link in this chain, from the original Greek thinkers to the monks who copied Latin manuscripts to the Byzantine scholars who kept Greek alive to the Baghdad translators who made it Arabic to the Toledo scholars who made it Latin again. Every single link required an act of will. Someone had to decide this was worth doing. Someone had to sit in a cold room or a hot room and do the work. Someone had to care enough about a set of ideas written by people long dead to give years of their life to making those ideas available to people not yet born. And the thing that strikes me most looking at the full picture is that the people who built this chain were not, for the most part, thinking about the chain. They were thinking about their own reasons. Al-Mamun wanted to know whether Aristotle's God and Allah could be reconciled. Jared of Cremona wanted to read Tommy. The monks at Wissenborg wanted to have enough liturgical books for the daily office. None of them knew they were building the foundation of the Western intellectual tradition. They just kept doing the work. And now the story takes its darkest turn because everything we've been building in this story, the libraries, the networks, the manuscripts, the centuries of accumulated knowledge, face something that none of it could defend against. Not a philosophical argument, not a competing ideology, a political decision, a king, and 8 years. That is all it took in the 16th century to undo what had taken 900 years to build. The story of what happened to the monastic libraries of England under Henry VIII is the story we've been moving toward without knowing it. The moment when everything becomes fragile and we discover just how thin the margin has always been between preservation and loss. That's exactly where we go next. The year is 1536, England, and a man named John Leland is riding. He's been riding for years, actually, across muddy roads and through market towns and past the gray stone walls of monasteries, his saddlebag stuffed with notes. He is in the formal language of his commission, the King's Antiquary, a title he invented for himself because the role he was performing had no name yet. What he was actually doing was watching a civilization dismantle itself. And he could not stop it. He could only ride faster. To understand what happened to the monastic libraries of England between 1536 and 1541, you need to understand what had set it in motion. Henry VIII, King of England since 159. A man who had once been praised as the most educated monarch in Europe, who had written a defense of the Catholic sacraments so impressive that Pope Leo X had given him the title Defender of the Faith, had decided he wanted a divorce. Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, had not given him a male heir. He wanted an Berlin. The Pope, entangled in his own political obligations to Catherine's nephew, refused to grant an annulment. Henry's response was to break with Rome entirely. In 1534, Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy, making Henry the supreme head of the Church of England. The Pope's authority in England was abolished. The monasteries which answered to Rome, not to the crown, were now politically anomalous, religiously suspect, and enormously wealthy. Between 1536 and 1541, Henry dissolved them. All of them, more than 800 religious houses across England, Wales, and Ireland. The monks and nuns and friars were dispersed. The buildings were sold to private buyers, stripped of their lead roofing, left to ruin. The gold and silver plate was melted down for the treasury. And the libraries were scattered. Let me give you two numbers that I think are worth holding together. Worcester Priory, now Worcester Cathedral, had 600 books at the time of dissolution. 6 of them are known to have survived. The Abbey of the Augustinian Friars at York had 646 volumes in its library. 3 are known to have survived. 1%, less than 1%. In these two cases, 1% of what existed managed to make it through what happened next. And what happened next is one of the most mundane and heartbreaking forms of cultural destruction imaginable. Not fire in most cases, not deliberate ideological burning, though that happened too, but something more banal and somehow more insulting. The books were sold by the cartload to grocers who used the parchment to wrap merchandise, to soap sellers who used it as packaging, to bookbinders who stripped the illuminated vellum leaves and used them as backing material for new cheaper books. John Bale, a Protestant clergyman and writer who worked alongside Leland trying to catalog what was being lost, walked through the city of Norwich shortly after the dissolution of its religious houses. And he described what he found there in language that even across 5 centuries feels like a scream. He wrote that all the library monuments of Norwich were turned to the use of their grocers, candle makers, soap makers, and other worldly occupiers. He described how those who purchased the dissolved monasteries were using the ancient manuscripts to serve their privies, to scour their candlesticks, and to rub their boots. Manuscripts that had taken months to produce. Manuscripts that contained texts no one had bothered to copy elsewhere, used as toilet paper, used to polish boots. A merchant Bale recorded a merchant whose name he declined to give. Perhaps out of some residual mercy, bought the entire contents of 2 noble libraries for 40 shillings. 40 shillings, less than the price of a modest horse. And this merchant Bale wrote with a kind of exhausted horror, had been using the parchment as gray paper ever since, and still had enough left for 10 more years of use. I want to pause there for a moment because I think it's easy to read those facts and treat them as historical abstractions. So, let me try to make them concrete. Think about what it took to make one of those manuscripts. The carves skinned for their parchment. The weeks of preparation, soaking, scraping, stretching, drying. The scribes bent over their work for months. The illuminators grinding pigments, applying gold leaf with brushes made of individual squirrel hairs. The generations of monks who copied them, corrected them, repaired their bindings, kept them dry. All of that labor, all of that accumulated care folded into a bundle sold for a few pennies used to wrap butter. That is what happened to a significant portion of England's medieval manuscript heritage in 8 years. And now let me tell you about the man who tried to stop it. John Leland was born around 153 in London. He was educated at St. Paul's School, then at Christ College in Cambridge, then in Paris, where a French professor introduced him to the manuscripts of ancient poets, and he fell, by his own account, completely and permanently in love. He returned to England around 1530 and spent several years cataloging the libraries of monasteries across the country in a scholarly project he'd been pursuing for his own satisfaction and for the glory of what he called English learning. Then the dissolution began, and Leland did something that required both courage and considerable shrewdness. He wrote to Henry's chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, warning him of what was being lost. He framed the argument in nationalist terms. England's manuscripts were being sold abroad to German scholars who were taking them home and claiming them as monuments of their own countries. The reputation of the English crown was suffering. It was exactly the right argument to make to exactly the right people. In 1533, Leland received a formal license from the king to search all monasteries and colleges for rare books by ancient authors. He was the king's antiquary, now officially empowered to take whatever he deemed worth preserving for the royal libraries. And he rode for a decade. He rode. He visited monastery after monastery as the dissolution was actively in progress. At Glastonbury, one of the richest and most ancient monastic libraries in England, he found so many books that he later wrote there was so great a number that it is not easily paralleled. He salvaged manuscripts from libraries that were already in the process of being stripped. He found treasures. A copy of a lost work by a 12th century poet discovered while rooting through the dust and moths of the library at Abington. He found waste at the Grey Friars in Oxford. He wrote dryly that he wouldn't have paid 3 for the collection. He noted everything. He wrote it down. Even when he couldn't save the books themselves, he wrote down that they had existed. But here is the part of John Leland's story that has always struck me most deeply. He survived the dissolution. He outlived it by 6 years. And the weight of what he had witnessed, the magnitude of what had been lost while he rode and catalogued and rescued and documented appears to have simply been too much. In February of 1547, not long after the death of Henry VIII, Leland fell beside his wits. He went mad. Certified insane in 1550, he died in 1552. At the age of about 48, still mentally deranged his great planned works. The comprehensive description of England he'd been building from his decades of notes unfinished. His manuscripts were taken into royal custody. His library, the manuscripts he had saved from the dissolution, was placed in the custody of a royal tutor. His tomb was lost when the church in which he was buried was destroyed in the Great Fire of London in 1666. John Leland, who spent his life trying to save things from being lost, had his own grave lost. History has a way of doing that. There is a question I want to ask you directly. Was this inevitable? When we look at a political decision of this magnitude, one man's desire for a divorce, one parliament's act of obedience, 8 years of systematic institutional dissolution, and we see the cultural wreckage that resulted, are we looking at an unusual catastrophe? Or are we looking at what power always does sooner or later to the things it cannot control? I've spent time with this question, and I don't think I have a clean answer. What I do think is that the dissolution reveals something that the entire history we've been tracing in this story has been pointing toward all along. Knowledge does not have a natural guardian. It does not protect itself. It does not survive by virtue of its own importance or beauty or irreplaceability. It survives only when someone decides specifically, deliberately, sometimes against enormous pressure and indifference and economic incentive, that it is worth saving. The monks who copied manuscripts were making that decision. Leland, riding through the dissolution, was making that decision. The German scholars who bought up English manuscripts and carried them home, even they, in their opportunistic way, were making that decision. And the grocers who wrapped their butter in illuminated vellum, they were making a different decision. Both were available. Both always are. Yet the dissolution was not quite the end of the story. Because scattered among all the loss among the manuscripts used as boot polish and the libraries sold for 40 shillings, there were people who gathered what they could. Matthew Parker, Archbishop of Canterbury under Elizabeth I, who collected hundreds of manuscripts and eventually bequeathed them to Corpus Christi College at Cambridge, where many still sit today. Sir Robert Cotton, whose extraordinary private collection formed the nucleus of what eventually became the British Library. And there were the survivals that happened by sheer accident. A copy of the Magna Carta rescued from a Tours shop in 1629. Manuscripts found tucked into binding boards of later books. Fragments of illuminated pages discovered pressed into the account books of men who had never known what they were handling. The things that survived because someone cared, or because luck intervened, or because the margin between a parchment page and a butter wrapper was on a particular Tuesday afternoon in a particular English town just wide enough for someone to hesitate. And so, as this long story of monastic learning approaches its end, we find ourselves standing between two truths. The first is that 900 years of accumulated effort, all the copying and preserving and connecting and teaching that we've been exploring, was in a significant measure undone in 8 years by one king's political self-interest. The second is that some of it survived, not all, not even most, but some. And the question that the story of the monastic libraries finally puts to us, the question it has been building toward all along, is what we make of that fragile, improbable, accidental survival. What does it mean that we have what we have? What do we owe the people who kept it? And what does all of this history from Cassiodorus on his family estate in the toe of Italy to Leland riding through the ruins of England's monasteries actually mean for the world we're living in right now? Those are the questions where this story has always been headed, and that's where we arrive next. Let me tell you something that I have been sitting with for the entire length of this story, and that I think is worth saying out loud now that we've reached the end. Everything you have heard in this video, every manuscript copied in cold silence, every monastery dissolved, every palimpsest scraped and recovered, every book curse written in desperate hope, every woman whose name survived only in a borrowing list. All of it happened before the printing press. Gutenberg's press, introduced around the year 1450, changed the economics of knowledge so fundamentally that the world we live in now is almost unrecognizable compared to the world we've been exploring. A book that once required months of labor and the skins of dozens of animals could suddenly be produced in hours in hundreds of copies at a fraction of the cost. The age of the monastic library in the strictest sense was over. And yet here is the argument I want to make in this final part of the story. And I want to make it clearly because I think it gets lost in most accounts of medieval history. The Renaissance did not happen despite the monasteries. It happened because of them. Not entirely, not simply, but in a way that is real and traceable and specific. The scholars of the Italian Renaissance, the men who went hunting through monastery libraries in the 14th and 15th centuries, pulling dusty manuscripts off shelves and reading them with an almost frantic excitement. What they found in those libraries was the preserved residue of everything this story has been about. The Virgil and Cicero that Benedictine monks had copied with such conflicted dedication. The Aristotle that traveled from Athens to Baghdad to Toledo and finally arrived in the Latin West. The medical texts that Hune had spent his life hunting down and translating. The Greek philosophical tradition that Xantine scholars had kept alive. Pager Bracciolini, the great Renaissance manuscript hunter, the man who found a complete copy of Lucretius's On the Nature of Things in a German monastery in 1417, a poem that had not been read for 1,000 years. He was not discovering something new. He was finding something old that has been kept imperfectly, expensively, stubbornly against all odds by the same tradition of copying and preserving that we've been following throughout this entire story. The Renaissance stood on the backs of monks. Not just monks on the backs of Arabic translators and Xantine scholars and Irish canonesses and abuses who wrote theology and nameless scribes who complained about their backs hurting while they copied texts they may not have understood. But the monks were essential. And then the Renaissance gave way to the scientific revolution. And the scientific revolution gave way to the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment gave way to the modern world, the world of medicine and mathematics and physics and all the accumulated knowledge that allows you to be lying in a comfortable room right now listening to this story on a device that would have looked like pure sorcery to every single person we've talked about tonight. Every link in that chain matters. Remove the monasteries. Remove the imperfect, costly, contradiction-filled tradition of monastic preservation and the chain breaks. We do not know exactly what the world looks like without it. We cannot run that experiment. But we can say with reasonable confidence that the path from ancient Greek philosophy to the modern university runs directly through the rooms we've been visiting tonight. Now, I want to bring this home in a way that I find genuinely moving and that I've been thinking about for a long time. What is the equivalent today of what the monks were doing? Because here's the thing, the problem they were solving has not gone away. The monks lived in a world where information was fragile, where the cost of reproduction was enormous, where most of what existed was in danger of being lost. They responded by building institutions dedicated to preservation. Imperfect institutions, contradictory institutions, institutions that sometimes censored what they were supposed to protect, but institutions nonetheless. We live in a world where information seems anything but fragile. There is more of it than anyone can process. It reproduces at essentially zero cost. The worry is not scarcity. It's the opposite. And yet the Internet Archive, a non-profit organization in San Francisco, has been trying since 1996 to do something very simple and very ambitious to preserve the Internet. To make sure that web pages, books, audio, video, software, the accumulated digital output of human civilization does not simply disappear. As of this recording, the Internet Archive holds over 860 billion web pages, millions of books, millions of hours of audio and video. It is, in the most literal sense, a library built not of stone, but of servers staffed not by monks, but by engineers and archivists, motivated not by the rule of Saint Benedict, but by the conviction arrived at independently, and for entirely secular reasons that knowledge is worth saving. The parallel is not perfect. It is never perfect, but I find it striking. When a website disappears, when a newspaper closes its digital archive, when a social media platform deletes its old posts, when a company goes under and takes its servers with it, the Internet Archive is often the only place where those words and images still exist. Somewhere in those servers is the digital equivalent of a palimpsest, the ghost of a website that no longer exists, waiting for someone to come looking. And then there is Wikipedia. I know the jokes about Wikipedia, the don't cite Wikipedia warnings from every teacher since about 2005, the debates about accuracy and reliability and editorial bias. But step back from those debates for a moment and consider what Wikipedia actually is. It is a project undertaken voluntarily and without pay by millions of people around the world to make the sum of human knowledge freely available to everyone. It is not run by a king or a pope or a corporation. It is not primarily motivated by profit. It is maintained by people who, for reasons I suspect they could not always fully explain, decided that this was worth doing. Does that remind you of anything? The monks in the scriptorium were not paid in any meaningful modern sense. They were not pursuing fame. Most of their names are unknown. They were not building careers. They were doing something that cost them enormous effort for reasons that were partly spiritual and partly practical and partly, I suspect, just because they were the kind of people who could not sit still while knowledge was in danger of being lost. I'm not claiming that the volunteers who write Wikipedia articles are monks. That would be absurd. But I am suggesting that the impulse, the underlying human impulse to take what is known and make it available to those who come after, is not so different. It has always been there. It was there in Cassiodorus, building his monastery on the shores of the Ionian Sea, because he could not stand the thought of what would be lost if he didn't. It was there in Leland, riding through the dissolution, writing down the names of books he could not save. It is there now in people we will never meet, doing work that most of us never think about. There is one more thing I want to say before we close, and it's the most personal thing in this whole story. One of the things I love most about the history of monastic libraries is what it says about the relationship between the individual human life and the long arc of civilization. No single monk built the tradition. No single act of copying changed history. Each person who sat at a desk in a cold stone room and copied a page of text was doing something that in isolation was vanishingly small. One page, one morning's work, one more letter saved, but accumulated across centuries, across hundreds of monasteries and thousands of lives. Those individual acts of small, unglamorous, often uncomfortable work added up to something worlding. I think about this often when I'm working on something that feels pointless or small or invisible. When the work is tedious and no one is watching and the results are so far in the future that I can't see them from where I'm standing. Oh, my hand, as one 9th century monk wrote. And then he kept going. There is a Latin inscription that was reportedly written on the wall of a scriptorium at the monastery of Nraam in France. The words read, "Scribe et scriptoes your discount posteriores." Write, scribe, so that those who come after may learn. Not so that you will be remembered. Not so that the work will be acknowledged. Not so that you will see the results. Just write so that those who come after may learn. I do not know of a better description of what the monastic world at its best was trying to do. And I do not know of a better aspiration for any of us in whatever form the work takes. So let me bring this all the way home, because this story started with a man on a hillside in southern Italy watching the Roman world fall apart around him. Cassiodorus was around 50 years old when he walked away from public life and went back to his family estate. He could have retired comfortably. He had earned it. Decades of service to powerful men. A career that would have looked to most observers like a success. Instead, he built a library. And then he spent the next 30-odd years filling it, organizing it, writing manuals for how to use it, how to copy from it, how to preserve it. He died around the year 583. He was nearly 100 years old. The library he built was dispersed within a generation of his death. The monastery he built did not survive him by long in any meaningful form. And yet the example he set that copying manuscripts was sacred work, that knowledge was worth systematic preservation, that an institution could be built around the idea that the past was worth keeping for the future, that example spread. It reached Monte Cassino, crossed the Alps. It reached the islands off the coast of Scotland. It traveled with the Irish monks to the continent. It was amplified by Charlemagne's decree. It produced the borrowing lists of Wissenberg and the plays of Zvida and the visions of Hildegard and the translations of Toledo. It was still alive when John Leland rode through the ruins of England's monasteries trying to salvage what he could before the last of it was used to polish boots. It is still alive now in the Internet Archive, in Wikipedia, in every library that exists, public or private, physical or digital. In every teacher who sits down with a student and says, "This is worth knowing." In every parent who reads to a child. In every person who decides to write something down because they want someone else to be able to read it later. The tradition does not require stone walls or Latin or vows of obedience. It requires only the conviction that knowledge is worth keeping and the willingness to do the work. I want to thank you for spending this time with me. This story, The Hidden World of Monastic Libraries, is one I have been living with for a long time, and sharing it with you has been one of the genuine pleasures of making this channel. We traveled a long way together tonight. From Cassiodorus on his fish pond hillside to the scriptorum in its cold stone silence to the Irish monks on their Atlantic islands making something so beautiful it looked like the work of angels, to the slow unraveling of the dissolution, and all the way to the question of what any of it means for us. I hope something in it stayed with you. I hope one of the names or one of the details or one of those margin notes that monks wrote when they thought no one was watching made you feel even for a moment the weight and the warmth of what human beings have been trying to do for each other across the centuries. If it did, if this story moved you or surprised you or made you think about something in a new way, I would genuinely love it if you shared it with someone who might feel the same. And if you have been here from the beginning, from that very first part where I described Cassiodorus deciding the world needed saving, thank you. Truly, I read every comment. I read the ones that say where you watched from and what time it was and whether it was raining. Those messages mean more than I know how to say. Subscribe if you haven't already. There is so much more ahead. I am building other stories with the same care that went into this one. Histories that most people never learned. Corners of the past that are more strange and more human and more relevant than the textbooks ever bothered to tell us. The next journey is already waiting, and I would love to take it with you. Good night.